the 7 hills and mysterious beginnings. Long before marble columns reached toward the sky and legions marched across 3 continents, there were 7 modest hills rising from the marshy banks of the Tiber River. The Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian hills sat quietly under the Italian sun, home to scattered tribes who had no idea they were living on the future centre of the world. These early inhabitants were a practical bunch. They built simple huts with thatched roofs and kept their livestock close. Archaeological evidence suggests they were already trading with their neighbours by the 10th century BC, exchanging pottery and bronze goods along the river routes. The location was perfect, really. Close enough to the sea for trade, far enough inland to avoid pirates, and those hills provided excellent defensive positions when disagreements with neighbours got heated. The Tiber itself was both blessing and curse. It flooded regularly, turning the lower areas into temporary lakes, but it also provided fresh water and a route to the Mediterranean. The early Romans learned to work with their river's moods, much like they would later learn to work with the moods of their gods and emperors. What's remarkable is how unremarkable it all seemed at the time. Just another collection of hilltop villages in a peninsula full of hilltop villages. No one was keeping careful records. No one was planning for posterity. They were simply living, farming, occasionally fighting, and slowly building something that would outlast them by millennia. But even in these quiet centuries, something was stirring. The seeds of Roman pragmatism were already taking root, that peculiar ability to adapt, absorb, and improve upon whatever they encountered. Soon legend would transform these humble beginnings into something far more dramatic. Romulus, Remus, and the she-wolf legend. Every great civilization needs a good origin story, and Rome's founding myth is delightfully dramatic. According to legend, it all began with twin brothers abandoned by a riverbank, nursed by a she-wolf, and destined to build a city. The Romans clearly understood that a mundane origin story involving gradual settlement and agricultural development wouldn't capture anyone's imagination. The tale starts with Aeneas, the Trojan hero who supposedly fled the burning city of Troy, and eventually settled in Italy. His descendants ruled the city of Alba Longa until a power struggle left 2 infant twins floating down the Tiber in a basket. The she-wolf found them first, followed by a shepherd named Faustulus who raised them as his own. The boys grew up strong, became leaders of a band of young men, and eventually decided to found their own city. Here's where sibling rivalry takes a deadly turn. Romulus and Remus couldn't agree on which hill to build their city upon, so they decided to let the gods choose through augury, watching the flight patterns of birds. Romulus saw 12 vultures over the Palatine Hill, while Remus saw only 6 over the Aventine. The gods had spoken, but Remus wasn't a gracious loser. When Romulus began building walls around his chosen site, Remus mocked them by jumping over the low fortifications. Romulus killed his brother on the spot, declaring that anyone who dared leap over Rome's walls would meet the same fate. It was April 21st, 753 BC, according to later Roman calculations, and Rome was officially founded on fratricide, a rather ominous beginning for a city that would become famous for its military prowess. The she-wolf became Rome's symbol, appearing on coins and sculptures throughout the empire. Modern historians suspect the story contains kernels of truth wrapped in layers of mythology, but the Romans preferred their version. After all, being raised by wolves sounded much more impressive than admitting your city grew slowly from a collection of farming villages. The Etruscan influence nobody talks about. While Romans loved telling stories about she-wolves and heroic twins, they were somewhat less enthusiastic about acknowledging their debt to the Etruscans. These sophisticated neighbours to the north had been building impressive cities, creating beautiful art and developing complex political systems, while Rome was still a modest settlement of farmers and shepherds. The Etruscans were, by most accounts, having a much better time than their Latin neighbours. They enjoyed elaborate banquets where men and women dined together as equals, a practice that scandalised more conservative societies. Their tomb paintings show people laughing, dancing, and generally enjoying life with a gusto that would make later Roman moralists deeply uncomfortable. They were skilled metalworkers, creating intricate bronze sculptures and gold jewellery that showcased their wealth and artistic sophistication. More importantly for Rome's future, the Etruscans had mastered the art of urban planning. They built proper sewers, paved roads, and impressive temples using the arch or architectural technique that Romans would later claim as their own innovation. They also developed complex religious practices involving the interpretation of omens, a skill that Romans found extremely useful for making important decisions and avoiding divine displeasure. Trade networks connected Etruscan cities across central Italy and beyond. They imported Greek pottery, Egyptian scarabs, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. Their ships carried Etruscan wine and metalwork to distant markets. Rome, sitting at the crossroads of several trade routes, couldn't help but absorb Etruscan influence along with Etruscan goods. The Romans adopted Etruscan religious practices, architectural techniques, and even some political institutions. The fasces, bundles of rods carried by Roman magistrates as symbols of authority, came straight from Etruscan tradition. Roman engineering prowess had deep Etruscan roots, though later Roman writers preferred to emphasize their own innovations rather than acknowledge their teachers. But the relationship between Rome and its northern neighbours was growing complicated, and soon Romans would find themselves ruled by Etruscan kings. The Seven Kings and Their Strange Stories. Roman historians later compiled neat lists of 7 kings who ruled Rome from its legendary founding in 753 BC until the establishment of the Republic in 5009 BC. Whether these men actually existed as described is anyone's guess, but their stories reveal what Romans valued and what they feared about absolute power. Romulus, the city's founder, supposedly ruled for 37 years before vanishing during a thunderstorm. Some said the gods took him up to heaven. Others whispered about senators with daggers, but officially he became the god Quirinus, and everyone agreed it was a very mysterious and impressive end for a king. His successor, Numa Pompilius, was chosen specifically because he was peaceful, religious, and unlikely to start any wars. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was Numa's complete opposite. He was so eager for military glory that he declared war on Alba Longa and settled the conflict with a famous battle between 3 Roman triplets and 3 Alban triplets. Only 1 Roman survived, but that was enough to secure victory and demonstrate that Romans took their combat sports very seriously. Ancus Marcius, the 4th king, tried to balance Numa's peacekeeping with Tullus's militarism. He built Rome's first prison, expanded the city's territory, and founded the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. He also established many of Rome's early religious and legal traditions, proving that sometimes compromise actually works in politics. Then came the Etruscan Dynasty. Tarquinius Priscus was supposedly an Etruscan who moved to Rome and impressed everyone so much with his wealth and competence that they made him king. He began major construction projects, including the first version of the Circus Maximus and the great sewer system that drained the marshy area between the hills. His wife Tanaquil was famous for her prophetic abilities and political maneuvering, making her Rome's first recorded power behind the throne. These royal stories blend history with legend so thoroughly that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible, but they were building toward a climax that would change Rome forever, when the last king would prove that absolute power really does corrupt absolutely. Numa Pompilius and the art of religious innovation. After Romulus disappeared in that convenient thunderstorm, the Romans faced their first succession crisis. They needed a king, but they were tired of war and violence, so they chose Numa Pompilius, a Sabine known for his piety and wisdom. It was perhaps the first recorded example of a society deliberately choosing the calm, boring candidate after experiencing too much excitement. Numa ruled for 43 peaceful years from 7115 to 673 BC, and spent his time creating the religious and legal foundations that would support Roman civilization for centuries. He was like the ancient world's ultimate bureaucrat, the sort of person who genuinely enjoyed organizing festivals and standardizing rituals. The Romans loved him for it. His greatest innovation was reorganizing the Roman calendar. The original Roman year had only 10 months, which created obvious problems when trying to coordinate agricultural activities or plan religious festivals. Numa added January and February, bringing the year to 12 months and 355 days. It still wasn't perfect, but it was a significant improvement over the previous system where spring might show up in what everyone thought was winter. Numa also established the College of Pontiffs, the priests who would maintain Rome's relationship with the gods. He created the Vestal Virgins, whose job was to keep the sacred flame of Vesta burning continuously. This was considered so important that if a Vestal Virgin let the flame go out, she would be beaten, and if she broke her vow of chastity, she would be buried alive. Romans didn't mess around when it came to their religious obligations. The king claimed to receive his wisdom from the nymph Egeria, who supposedly met with him in a sacred grove outside the city. Whether this was genuine religious experience, political theatre, or simply Numa's way of getting some quiet time to think is unclear. But it worked. People respected his authority because they believed he had divine guidance. Numa's reforms created a sense of shared identity among Rome's diverse population. Rituals and festivals brought different tribes together, creating common traditions and shared calendar. He proved that religion could be a unifying force when properly managed, a lesson that future Roman leaders would remember when they needed to integrate conquered peoples into their growing empire. The Tarquin Dynasty and royal scandals. The Tarquin kings brought wealth, ambition, and eventually tyranny to Rome. Tarquinius Priscus had been a successful and generally well-liked ruler, but royal power has a way of going to people's heads over time. His successor, Servius Tullius, managed to expand Rome's territory and organize the citizen body into classes based on wealth, creating a system that would influence Roman society for centuries. But it was the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, who earned the title the Proud and managed to destroy the monarchy forever. He came to power by murdering Servius Tullius, his own father-in-law, with help from his wife Tullia, who was Servius's daughter. Family gatherings must have been awkward after that, assuming anyone survived them. Tarquin the Proud ruled as an absolute tyrant, ignoring the Senate and making decisions without consulting anyone. He completed grand building projects, including the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, but he funded them through heavy taxation and forced labour. The Romans began to realise that having a king who could do whatever he wanted wasn't quite as convenient as they'd originally thought. The dynasty's downfall came through a sexual assault that outraged Roman society. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, the wife of a prominent Roman named Collatinus. Lucretia told her husband and father what had happened, then killed herself from shame. Her suicide galvanized opposition to the royal family and provided the moral justification needed for revolution. Lucius Junius Brutus, who had been pretending to be mentally disabled to avoid Tarquin's suspicion, revealed his true intelligence and led the uprising. The Romans expelled the entire Tarquin family and swore they would never again be ruled by kings. It was a dramatic end to the monarchy, involving murder, suicide, deception, and revolution. The Romans had learned an important lesson about power. Give too much of it to one person, and eventually they'll use it badly. They were about to try something completely different, though whether their new system would actually work better remained to be seen. The birth of the Republic and consul chaos. In 509 BC, the Romans embarked on one of history's most ambitious political experiments. Instead of replacing one king with another, they decided to divide executive power between two consuls, who would serve for only 1 year and keep watch over each other. It was like having two CEOs running the same company, which sounds like a recipe for disaster, but somehow worked for nearly 5 centuries. Lucius Junius Brutus became one of the first consuls along with Collatinus, Lucretia's widowed husband. The irony was immediate. Collatinus, despite being a hero of the revolution, had to resign because his family name was Tarquinius, and the Romans decided they couldn't trust anyone connected to the old royal family. Revolutionary paranoia set in quickly. The new system was delightfully complicated. Each consul could veto the other's decisions, which meant nothing important happened unless both men agreed. In times of crisis, they could appoint a dictator for 6 months, giving him absolute power but only temporarily. It was like having an emergency monarchy with a built-in expiration date. The Senate, which had existed under the kings, became much more powerful. These were the wealthy patrician families who claimed descent from the original followers of Romulus. They controlled religious law, foreign policy, and most important decisions. The common citizens, called plebeians, could vote in assemblies but had limited real power. Democracy, Roman style, was still very much a work in progress. External threats tested the new system immediately. The exiled Tarquin family convinced Lars Porsena, an Etruscan king, to help them regain power. Roman legends tell of heroic defenders like Horatius at the bridge and Mucius Scaevola burning his hand off to show Roman determination, though historians suspect these stories grew more dramatic with each telling. The Republic survived its first challenges, but the tension between patricians and plebeians was already building. The wealthy controlled the system, while everyone else did most of the fighting and working. This arrangement would create centuries of internal conflict, proving that even revolutionary governments can quickly develop their own problems. The 12 Tables and early legal drama. By 450 BC, the plebeians had grown tired of being governed by laws that only the patrician priests knew and interpreted. Legal proceedings were conducted according to ancient customs passed down orally through generations of aristocratic families. This meant that common citizens never knew if they were breaking the law until they found themselves in court, facing judges who seemed to make up rules as they went along. The plebeians demanded written laws that everyone could read and understand. After years of pressure, including threats of mass emigration that would have left Rome without farmers or soldiers, the patricians finally agreed to create a written legal code. They appointed 10 men, called decemvirs, to study foreign laws and draft Rome's first comprehensive legal document. The result was the 12 Tables, bronze tablets displaying Rome's fundamental laws in clear, simple language. The laws covered everything from property rights and marriage customs to the proper punishment for theft and assault. Some provisions seem harsh by modern standards, such as allowing creditors to dismember debtors who couldn't pay, but others established principles that still influence legal systems today. The tables established that all citizens had the right to legal proceedings and that punishments should fit crimes. They also included wonderfully specific regulations about daily life. Citizens were forbidden from burying the dead within the city limits, a sensible public health measure. They couldn't hold noisy funerals at night, suggesting that even ancient Romans had to deal with inconsiderate neighbours. One table dealt entirely with sacred law, showing how intertwined religious and civil authority remained. Another covered family relationships, including the paterfamilias's absolute power over his household. Roman fathers could legally sell their children into slavery or even execute them, though social pressure usually prevented such extreme measures. The 12 Tables were revolutionary because they applied equally to patricians and plebeians, at least in theory. Knowledge of the law was no longer a patrician monopoly. Citizens could finally understand their rights and obligations, even if they couldn't always enforce them. Legal equality was still a long way off, but the foundation had been laid for a more just society. Patricians versus plebeians, the original class war. The early Roman Republic was essentially two societies trying to coexist in the same city. The patricians claimed divine right to rule based on their supposed descent from Rome's first families. They controlled the priesthood, the senate, and most magistrates. The plebeians, everyone else, did most of the actual work but had little political power. This arrangement worked about as well as you'd expect. The conflict began almost immediately after the monarchy ended. Plebeians served in the army, paid taxes and followed laws, but they couldn't hold major offices or marry patricians. When they fell into debt, they could be enslaved by their creditors. It was a system designed by the wealthy for the wealthy, and the non-wealthy were getting tired of it. The plebeians' most effective weapon was withdrawal. When tensions reached breaking points, they would simply leave the city and set up camp outside Rome's boundaries, refusing to work or fight until their demands were met. This was called the secession of the plebs, and it worked because Rome couldn't function without its common citizens. The first major secession occurred in 494 BC, when plebeians demanded debt relief and political representation. They established their own assembly and elected tribunes to protect their interests. These tribunes had the power to veto any magistrate's decision that harmed plebeian interests, including the consuls themselves. It was democracy by obstruction, but it was effective. Over the following centuries, plebeians gradually won more rights through persistence and strategic non-cooperation. They gained the right to hold the consulship in 367 BC, though wealthy plebeians often had more in common with patricians than with poor citizens. Class conflict evolved into a more complex struggle between rich and poor that transcended the original patrician-plebeian divide. The irony is that Rome's internal conflicts made it stronger externally. The need to keep both patricians and plebeians satisfied forced the government to expand, creating new offices, new opportunities, and new territories to exploit. Domestic tensions drove imperial expansion, though the Romans probably didn't plan it that way. The Gallic Sack and Rome's first reality check. In 390 BC, Rome learned the hard way that being master of central Italy didn't make them invincible. A Celtic army led by a chief named Brennus swept down from the north, defeated the Roman legions at the Battle of the Alia, and marched straight into the city. It was Rome's first major military disaster, and it shattered their confidence in their own superiority. The Gauls had been migrating into northern Italy for decades, establishing settlements and occasionally raiding southward. Romans had heard about these tall, fierce warriors who painted themselves blue and charged into battle screaming, but they assumed their disciplined legions could handle any barbarian threat. The assumption proved spectacularly wrong. At the Alia River, the Roman army simply collapsed when faced with the Gallic charge. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled back toward Rome, spreading panic among the population. Most citizens evacuated the city, leaving only a small garrison on the heavily fortified Capitoline Hill. The Gauls occupied Rome for several months, looting and burning much of the city. The siege of the Capitoline became the stuff of legend. According to Roman historians, the defenders were saved when sacred geese belonging to the goddess Juno heard Gallic soldiers trying to climb the hill at night and raised such a ruckus that the guards woke up. Whether or not geese actually saved Rome, the garrison held out until Brennus agreed to leave in exchange for 1,000 pounds of gold. When the Romans complained that the Gauls were using false weights to cheat them, Brennus supposedly threw his sword onto the scales and declared Vae Victis, woe to the conquered. It was a humiliating lesson in power politics that Romans never forgot. From that day forward, they vowed never again to allow foreign enemies to threaten their city. The sack motivated massive military reforms and expansion. Romans realized they needed to control more territory to create buffer zones around their city. They also learned to take Celtic warriors seriously, beginning centuries of conflict that would eventually bring them face to face with druids, warrior queens, and a brilliant general named Julius Caesar. The Samnite Wars and mountain fighting. After recovering from the Gallic humiliation, Rome turned its attention to the Samnites, a confederation of mountain tribes who controlled much of central and southern Italy. The Samnites were tough, organised, and had no interest in becoming Roman allies. What followed were 3 wars spanning nearly 70 years, teaching Romans that conquest was rarely quick or easy. The Samnites lived in the Apennine Mountains, where they had developed a warrior culture perfectly adapted to their rugged homeland. They were skilled at guerrilla warfare, knew every mountain path, and could disappear into the hills whenever Roman legions came looking for them. Fighting the Samnites was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. The First War began in 343 BC over control of Campania, the fertile region around modern Naples. Both Rome and the Samnites wanted to influence the Greek cities there with their wealth and strategic ports. The war dragged on for 3 years with no decisive victories on either side, ending in a treaty that satisfied no one and guaranteed future conflict. The Second War, starting in 326 BC, proved much more serious. The Romans suffered their most humiliating defeat since the Gallic Sack at the Caudine Forks in 321 BC. The entire Roman army was trapped in a narrow mountain pass and forced to surrender. The Samnites made them pass under a yoke of spears, symbolically treating them like cattle. Roman pride never recovered from this indignity. But Romans learned from their mistakes. They adapted their tactics to mountain warfare, improved their equipment, and developed new strategies for fighting in difficult terrain. The manipular system with smaller, more flexible units proved better suited to broken ground than the rigid phalanx formation they had inherited from the Greeks. The Third War, from 298 to 290 BC, finally broke Samnite power. Rome had grown stronger and more experienced, while the Samnites struggled to maintain their confederation. By the war's end, the mountain tribes were incorporated into the Roman alliance system, adding their military skills to Rome's growing strength. The mountains that had protected them became training grounds for Roman resilience. Pyrrhus and his expensive victories. In 280 BC, Rome encountered its first truly professional Hellenistic army when King Pyrrhus of Epirus arrived in Italy with elephants, expert cavalry, and soldiers trained in the latest Greek military techniques. The Romans had been fighting Italian tribes for decades, but Pyrrhus represented a completely different level of sophistication and firepower. Pyrrhus was a distant relative of Alexander the Great, which in the Hellenistic world was like having the best possible military credentials. He was also restless, ambitious, and always looking for new conquests to fund his expensive lifestyle. When the Greek city of Tarentum asked for help against Rome, he saw an opportunity for glory and profit in the western Mediterranean. His army was impressive by any standard. The Epirot phalanx bristled with 18-foot spears called sarissas. His cavalry was among the finest in the Mediterranean. Most intimidatingly, he brought 20 war elephants, creatures that Romans had never seen before. When elephants charged, Roman horses panicked and infantry formations broke apart. It was ancient shock and awe. At the Battle of Heraclea, Pyrrhus achieved a complete tactical victory, but at enormous cost. Roman legions fought with desperate courage, inflicting heavy casualties on his professional soldiers. After the battle, Pyrrhus supposedly observed that another such victory would destroy his army entirely. Thus was born the phrase Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win so expensive it might as well be a defeat. The war dragged on for several years, with Pyrrhus winning battles but unable to force Rome to surrender. The Romans simply refused to quit, replacing their losses and continuing to fight. Pyrrhus discovered what many later enemies would learn. Romans were remarkably stubborn when they decided something was important. Eventually Pyrrhus abandoned his Italian adventure and sailed off to try conquering Sicily instead. The Romans had learned valuable lessons about fighting professional armies and war elephants. They had also gained confidence in their ability to defeat anyone, no matter how impressive their reputation. This confidence would serve them well in the coming wars against Carthage. The Punic Wars begin. Carthage versus Rome. By 264 BC, Rome controlled most of Italy south of the Po River, but across the Mediterranean lay another power with similar ambitions. Carthage, founded by Phoenician colonists from the city of Tyre, had built a commercial empire stretching across North Africa, southern Spain, and the western Mediterranean islands. Both cities were expanding, and eventually they would have to deal with each other. Carthage was everything Rome was not. Where Romans prized military service and civic duty, Carthaginians focused on trade and profit. Their ships carried goods from Britain to Egypt, their merchants spoke a dozen languages, and their banks financed commerce across the known world. They preferred to hire mercenaries rather than fight themselves, which Romans considered both practical and slightly contemptible. The immediate cause of conflict was Sicily, that large island sitting strategically between Italy and Africa. Both powers wanted to control its cities, harbours and grain production. When a group of Italian mercenaries seized the city of Messana and asked for help, both Rome and Carthage responded. Neither was willing to let the other dominate Sicily, and compromise seemed impossible. The First Punic War began almost accidentally, but it revealed fundamental differences between the two civilizations. Romans approached warfare as a matter of honour and national survival. Carthaginians viewed it as an extension of business, something to be conducted efficiently and profitably. Both attitudes had advantages and disadvantages. Rome had never fought a major naval war before, but they quickly realized they would need a fleet to compete with Carthage's maritime power. Roman engineers studied a captured Carthaginian warship and built 120 copies in 60 days, an impressive feat of reverse engineering and mass production. They also invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into land battles, playing to Roman strengths. The war would last 23 years and cost both sides enormous casualties and resources. It was the beginning of a century-long struggle that would determine whether Mediterranean civilization developed along Roman or Carthaginian lines. The stakes could not have been higher, though neither side fully understood what they were starting. Hannibal crosses the Alps with elephants. The Second Punic War began with one of the most audacious military campaigns in ancient history. Hannibal Barca, son of a Carthaginian general who had made him swear eternal hatred of Rome, decided to attack the Romans where they least expected it. Instead of fighting in Sicily or Africa, he would march from Spain, cross the Alps and invade Italy itself. Hannibal's army was a multicultural force that reflected Carthage's commercial empire. Spanish infantry, Numidian cavalry, Celtic warriors and a few dozen war elephants all served under Carthaginian officers. The army spoke multiple languages and fought with different weapons and tactics, but Hannibal welded them into an effective fighting force through a combination of personal charisma and professional competence. The Alpine crossing in 2018 BC became legendary even in antiquity. Ancient sources describe avalanches, hostile mountain tribes, and terrain so difficult that engineers had to cut paths through solid rock using fire and vinegar. The elephants, already struggling with the cold and altitude, suffered terribly. Most died during the crossing, though a few survivors would terrorize Roman armies for years to come. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley, his army was reduced by half, but still formidable. More importantly, he had achieved complete strategic surprise. Romans had been preparing to fight in Spain and Africa, not defending their own homeland. Suddenly their careful plans were worthless, and they faced an enemy army in northern Italy. Local Celtic tribes, still bitter about Roman conquest, joined Hannibal's cause. His army swelled with new recruits who knew the local terrain and had their own reasons for fighting Romans. For the first time since the Gallic Sack 3 centuries earlier, Rome faced an existential threat on Italian soil. Roman confidence, built up through centuries of successful expansion, was about to face its greatest test. Hannibal was not just another ambitious king or tribal confederation. He was a military genius leading a professional army, and he had come to destroy Rome itself. The question was whether Roman institutions and Roman stubbornness could survive what was coming next. Carne, Rome's worst military disaster. On August 2nd, 2016 BC, at a small town in southeastern Italy called Cannae, Hannibal achieved what military historians still consider the perfect tactical battle. Facing a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own, he managed to surround and destroy it almost completely. It was a masterpiece of generalship that left Rome wondering if their empire would survive the year. The Romans had learned caution after losing several smaller battles to Hannibal, but political pressure and military pride eventually forced them to seek a decisive engagement. They assembled the largest army in Roman history, over 80,000 men under the command of 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Surely, they reasoned, Hannibal couldn't defeat such an overwhelming force. Hannibal positioned his weakest troops, Spanish and Celtic infantry, in the centre of his battle line. His best African heavy infantry stood on the flanks, partially hidden behind the front ranks. As the Romans advanced, their massive formation pushed against the Carthaginian centre, which gradually gave ground in a controlled retreat. The Roman commanders thought they were winning, but Hannibal had planned this apparent weakness. As his centre bent backward, it formed a crescent shape that began to envelop the Roman flanks. The African infantry on the wings wheeled inward, and Hasdrubal's cavalry, having defeated the Roman horsemen, charged into the Roman rear. The entire Roman army was trapped in a shrinking pocket with no way to escape. What followed was systematic slaughter. Roman soldiers couldn't use their weapons effectively in the crush, while Carthaginian troops picked them off from all sides. Consul Paulus died fighting bravely, while Varro escaped with a few thousand survivors. Nearly 70,000 Romans died in a single day, more casualties than the United States suffered in the entire Vietnam War. News of Cannae sent panic through Rome. Many expected Hannibal to march on the city immediately and finish what he had started. Instead, he chose to consolidate his position in southern Italy, seeking more allies and reinforcements. Romans would later say that Hannibal knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one, though the reality was more complex than that simple criticism suggested. Scipio Africanus and the comeback story. In Rome's darkest hour, when Hannibal seemed unstoppable and allies were abandoning the Roman cause, an unlikely hero emerged. Publius Cornelius Scipio was only in his 20s when he volunteered to take command in Spain, a posting so dangerous that no experienced general wanted it. Most expected him to die gloriously and accomplish nothing, but Scipio had been studying Hannibal's tactics and developing his own strategies. Scipio understood what other Roman commanders had missed. You couldn't beat Hannibal by copying his methods, but you could learn from them. He studied the Carthaginians' use of cavalry, his flexible tactics, and his ability to adapt to different situations. More importantly, Scipio realized that Rome's real strength lay not in any single battle, but in their ability to absorb losses and keep fighting. In Spain, Scipio achieved what seemed impossible. He captured New Carthage, Carthage's main base in Iberia, through a combination of careful intelligence gathering and bold assault. When the tide went out farther than usual, Roman soldiers waded across a lagoon that the defenders thought was impassable. Sometimes luck favours the prepared mind, and Scipio was very well prepared. Victory followed victory as Scipio drove Carthaginian forces out of Spain. He treated captured enemies with unprecedented clemency, releasing prisoners without ransom and respecting local customs. Spanish tribes began switching sides, drawn by Roman generosity and impressed by Roman military success. The Carthaginian Empire in Iberia, built over generations, crumbled in just a few years. But Scipio's greatest insight was strategic rather than tactical. Instead of trying to defeat Hannibal in Italy, where the Carthaginian general held every advantage, Scipio proposed invading Africa and forcing Carthage to recall their greatest general to defend their homeland. It was a risky plan that required Romans to trust a young commander with their entire future. The Senate finally agreed, though with limited resources and considerable skepticism. Scipio sailed for Africa in 24 BC, carrying with him Rome's hopes for survival. He was about to prove that sometimes the best defense really is a good offense, and that even military geniuses can be outmaneuvered by someone willing to change the rules of the game. Cato's obsession with destroying Carthage. Marcus Porcius Cato was a farmer's son from the hills outside Rome, who became the Republic's most influential moral voice. He was also completely obsessed with destroying Carthage, ending every speech he gave in the Senate with the phrase "Carthage must be destroyed," regardless of what topic he was supposedly discussing. Senators probably rolled their eyes when Cato stood up to speak, knowing he would somehow connect grain distribution or road repairs to the Carthaginian menace. Cato had fought against Hannibal as a young man and never forgot the terror of those dark years when Rome's survival seemed doubtful. He belonged to a generation that viewed Carthage not just as a rival but as an existential threat that could never be trusted. Even after Rome's victory in the Second Punic War, he remained convinced that Carthage would eventually recover and try again. His paranoia might have seemed excessive, but it wasn't entirely unreasonable. Carthage was recovering from their defeat faster than many Romans had expected. Their merchants were rebuilding trade networks, their population was growing, and their treasury was filling with gold from renewed commerce. The war indemnity they owed Rome was being paid ahead of schedule, which paradoxically made Cato more suspicious rather than less. In 1530 BC, Cato visited Carthage as part of a diplomatic mission and was shocked by what he saw. The city was prosperous, bustling with activity, and showing no signs of the defeated, broken power that Romans expected. Cato returned to Rome convinced that decisive action was necessary before Carthage became strong enough to threaten Roman interests again. His campaign for a third war against Carthage mixed genuine strategic concerns with personal obsession. Cato would bring fresh figs from Africa to Senate meetings, pointing out that they had been picked just 3 days earlier, demonstrating how close and dangerous the Carthaginian threat remained. It was effective political theatre from someone who understood that fear could be a powerful motivator. Other senators, particularly Scipio Nasica, argued that Rome needed Carthage as a rival to maintain civic virtue and military readiness. They worried that without external threats, Romans would grow soft and corrupt, but Carthage's voice proved more persuasive, especially when Carthage gave Rome the excuse they needed by fighting a war without Roman permission. The Third Punic War and Carthage's end. The Third Punic War was less a war than an execution, though it took 3 years to complete. Carthage's crime was defending itself against Numidia without asking Rome's permission first, a technical violation of the treaty that ended the Second Punic War. It was the kind of legalistic excuse that gave Romans plausible deniability while they did something they had wanted to do anyway. When Carthaginian ambassadors arrived in Rome to negotiate, they found the Senate in an unforgiving mood. The Romans demanded that Carthage hand over all their weapons and military equipment, which the Carthaginians reluctantly agreed to do. Then came the final demand: the entire population must abandon their city and resettle at least 10 miles from the coast. Carthage as a maritime power would cease to exist. This was too much. The Carthaginians had accepted military defeat and economic subordination, but asking them to abandon the city their ancestors had built was like asking them to stop being Carthaginian. They chose to fight instead, knowing they had little chance of victory but unwilling to accept cultural extinction without resistance. The siege that followed was a testament to both Carthaginian determination and Roman persistence. The city's walls were massive and well maintained. The harbour was defended by ingenious engineering, and the population was unified by desperation. Roman forces under various commanders made little progress for 2 years, facing fierce resistance and clever defensive tactics. Everything changed when young Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, took command in 1407 BC. He tightened the siege systematically, building walls and fortifications that completely encircled the city and cut off all supply routes. Carthage slowly starved while Roman engines battered their defences day and night. The final assault came in the spring of 1406 BC. Roman soldiers fought their way through the city street by street, house by house, against defenders who knew that surrender meant death or slavery. When resistance finally ended, Scipio ordered the entire city destroyed. Buildings were torn down, the ground was ploughed and cursed, and the population was sold into slavery. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, ceased to exist except in memory and historical accounts. The conquest of Greece and cultural confusion. While Rome was systematically destroying Carthage, they were simultaneously conquering the Greek world, but this presented a completely different kind of challenge. The Greeks had military technology and wealth that Romans could appreciate, but they also had philosophy, art, and cultural sophistication that many Romans found both attractive and disturbing. Greek civilization was ancient when Rome was still a collection of hilltop villages. They had produced philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, dramatists like Sophocles and Euripides, and scientists like Archimedes and Eratosthenes. Their sculpture and architecture set standards that Romans desperately wanted to emulate, but they also had a reputation for political instability, military weakness, and moral decadence that conservative Romans found alarming. The conquest began almost by accident, as Rome intervened in Greek disputes to protect their allies and interests. The Aetolian League asked for Roman help against the Antigonid Kingdom of Macedonia. King Philip V had been allied with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, giving Romans both motive and opportunity for revenge. What started as a limited intervention gradually escalated into full-scale conquest. Roman legions proved superior to Greek phalanxes in most situations, but the real Roman advantage was political rather than military. The Greek world was hopelessly fragmented, with city-states, leagues, and kingdoms constantly fighting each other. Romans offered stability, protection, and generous terms to cities that surrendered voluntarily. Many Greeks found Roman rule preferable to the chaos of endless local conflicts. The cultural impact flowed both ways. Romans acquired Greek slaves who became tutors, secretaries, and advisors. They imported Greek art, literature, and ideas along with Greek grain and wine. Wealthy Roman families began sending their sons to study in Athens, Rhodes, and other centres of Greek learning. Latin literature was revolutionised by Greek models and techniques. But this cultural invasion worried traditional Romans like Cato the Elder, who saw Greek influence as a threat to Roman character and values. He famously declared that Romans would lose their empire when they became saturated with Greek letters. The tension between Roman power and Greek culture would shape the empire for centuries to come. The Macedonian Wars and Hellenistic drama. The kingdom of Macedonia under Philip V and his son Perseus represented everything Romans both admired and distrusted about Greek civilization. The Macedonians had military traditions dating back to Alexander the Great, but they also had the political instability and moral complexity that Romans associated with Greek decline. The wars that followed were as much about cultural identity as territorial control. Philip V had made the mistake of allying with Hannibal during Rome's darkest hour, though his help proved largely ineffective. When Romans finally had time to settle accounts, they found the Macedonian king rebuilding his power and threatening the Greek cities that Rome considered their friends. The Second Macedonian War began in 2000 BC with Roman claims to be protecting Greek freedom, a statement that must have amused anyone familiar with Roman methods. The war's climax came at Cynocephalae in 1970 BC, where Roman flexibility defeated Macedonian tradition. The famous phalanx, with its forest of 18-foot spears, had dominated Mediterranean battlefields since Alexander's time, but Roman maniples could adapt to broken ground and exploit gaps in enemy formations. When the Macedonian phalanx broke, it collapsed completely, and Philip V was forced to accept harsh terms. Perseus, who became king in 179 BC, tried to restore Macedonian power through careful diplomacy and military rebuilding. He negotiated with Greek cities, Celtic tribes, and even Carthage, seeking allies for what everyone knew would be a final confrontation with Rome. His efforts were impressive but ultimately futile. because Rome had grown too powerful for any single kingdom to resist. The Third Macedonian War ended at Pydna in 1608 BC with another Roman victory that demonstrated their military evolution. Roman legions had learned to coordinate with cavalry, use missile weapons effectively, and maintain discipline even in chaotic conditions. They had become the most professional fighting force in the Mediterranean world, combining Roman organization with techniques borrowed from every enemy they had fought. Perseus was captured and displayed in a Roman triumph, marking the end of Macedonian independence. But the victory created new problems for Rome, as they now controlled territories they didn't quite know how to govern. The age of casual conquest was ending, and the age of imperial administration was about to begin. Spain and the Celtiberian resistance. Spain proved to be Rome's most stubborn conquest, a land where every mountain valley seemed to hide another tribe ready to fight for their independence. The Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of Celtic and Iberian peoples, who had been fighting each other for centuries, but they quickly discovered they had more in common when Romans arrived demanding tribute and submission. The conquest began during the Second Punic War, when Scipio Africanus drove out Carthaginian forces and established Roman control over the eastern and southern coasts. But the interior remained a mystery, filled with tribes who practiced strange customs, worshipped unknown gods, and showed an alarming willingness to die rather than surrender. Roman commanders soon learned that conquering Spain would require patience, diplomacy, and occasional brutal examples. The Celtiberians were particularly troublesome. These Celtic peoples had adopted Iberian military techniques and developed a warrior culture that emphasized personal honor above survival. Their hilltop settlements, called castros, were expertly fortified and could withstand lengthy sieges. When Romans finally captured these strongholds, they often found that the defenders had committed mass suicide rather than face enslavement. Roman tactics gradually adapted to Spanish conditions. Large-scale battles were rare, replaced by raids, ambushes, and sieges that could last for months. Roman engineers learned to build camps and fortifications suitable for mountain warfare, while Roman diplomats discovered the importance of understanding local politics and religious customs. Spain became a training ground for Roman innovation and persistence. The most famous resistance came from Numantia, a Celtiberian stronghold that held out for 20 years against repeated Roman assaults. The city's defenders used their knowledge of local terrain to harass Roman supply lines and escape encirclement. They also employed psychological warfare, displaying the heads of captured Romans and challenging their enemies to single combat. It was guerrilla warfare at its most effective. Roman prestige suffered with each failed siege, and the Spanish Wars became deeply unpopular in Rome. Soldiers dreaded being assigned to Spanish legions, knowing they faced years of uncomfortable campaigning with little prospect of decisive victory. But Romans had invested too much blood and treasure to abandon Spain now, and eventually they would find commanders capable of matching Spanish determination with Roman stubbornness. The Jugurthine War and African adventures. In 1112 BC, Rome became entangled in a North African conflict that would expose corruption in the Senate and reveal how money could buy Roman foreign policy. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, had learned Latin, studied Roman customs, and understood exactly how the Roman political system worked. He used this knowledge to manipulate Roman senators while building his own power in Africa. Numidia was strategically important to Rome because it controlled trade routes between the Mediterranean coast and the interior of Africa. The kingdom had been divided between three princes after the death of King Micipsa, but Jugurtha systematically eliminated his rivals through assassination and warfare. When Roman commissioners arrived to investigate, they found themselves recipients of generous bribes and lavish hospitality. Jugurtha's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. He bribed Roman officials to support his claims, hired Roman negotiators to represent his interests, and even brought his gold directly to Rome when summoned to testify before the Senate. His famous observation that Rome was a city for sale reflected his accurate assessment of republican politics during this period. The war that followed was a study in Roman military incompetence combined with African tactical superiority. Jugurtha understood desert warfare, mobile tactics, and the psychology of his enemies. Roman commanders appointed through political connections rather than military merit repeatedly fell into traps and suffered humiliating defeats. The Numidian king seemed to anticipate every Roman move. Roman public opinion gradually turned against the war as reports of corruption and military failure reached the city. The people demanded competent leadership and honest government, creating political opportunities for ambitious men who promised reform. The Jugurthine War became a catalyst for the internal conflicts that would eventually destroy the Republic. Success finally came under Gaius Marius, a tough professional soldier from a modest background who cared more about winning than about politics. Marius reformed the Roman army, making it more flexible and professional, then systematically hunted down Jugurtha through diplomacy and military pressure. When Jugurtha was finally captured through betrayal by his own allies, Romans celebrated not just military victory but the triumph of competence over corruption. The Cimbri and Teutones invasion. Around 105 BC, Rome faced its greatest military crisis since Hannibal, when massive Germanic tribes began moving south through Gaul toward Italy. The Cimbri and Teutones were not armies in the traditional sense, but entire peoples on the move, including women, children, and elderly, seeking new lands to settle. They had already defeated several Roman armies and seemed unstoppable. These Germanic peoples were physically imposing, standing taller than most Romans and fighting with fierce enthusiasm that intimidated even experienced legionaries. They painted their shields, bleached their hair, and charged into battle screaming war cries in languages Romans couldn't understand. Their wagon trains stretched for miles, carrying entire families and tribal possessions toward what they hoped would be new homes. Roman commanders initially misunderstood the threat, treating the migration as a conventional military campaign that could be resolved through a few decisive battles. But the Germanic tribes moved unpredictably, avoided direct confrontations when possible, and could field enormous numbers of warriors when forced to fight. Traditional Roman tactics proved inadequate against such unconventional enemies. The disaster at Arausio in 1005 BC demonstrated just how unprepared Rome was for this kind of warfare. 2 Roman armies, totaling nearly 120,000 men, were completely destroyed when they failed to coordinate their attacks and allowed the Germanic tribes to defeat them separately. It was the worst Roman military disaster since Cannae, and it sent panic through Italy. Romans began to fear that their city might be sacked again, as it had been by the Gauls 3 centuries earlier. The Germanic tribes seemed capable of sweeping aside any resistance and marching straight to Rome's gates. Emergency measures were implemented, including the recall of veterans and the mobilization of emergency reserves that hadn't been used since the darkest days of the Second Punic War. But the tribes made a crucial strategic error by dividing their forces, with the Cimbri moving east toward the Danube while the Teutones continued south through Gaul. This gave Rome time to prepare and allowed Gaius Marius, fresh from his victories in Africa, to concentrate his reformed legions against each group separately. The stage was set for battles that would determine whether Germanic peoples or Roman legions would dominate Western Europe. Marius and his military reforms. Gaius Marius was the right man at the right moment, a practical soldier who understood that Rome's military system needed fundamental changes to meet new challenges. Born into a modest plebeian family, he had risen through military competence rather than political connections, giving him perspectives that aristocratic commanders often lacked. His reforms would transform Roman legions into the professional force that would conquer the Mediterranean world. The old Roman army had been based on property qualifications, with citizens required to provide their own equipment and serve for limited periods before returning to their farms and businesses. This system worked well for seasonal campaigns in Italy, but it was inadequate for the long wars of conquest that had become Rome's specialty. Poor citizens couldn't afford military equipment, while wealthy citizens often preferred to avoid dangerous foreign service. Marius opened military service to all citizens regardless of wealth. With the state providing standardized equipment and professional training, soldiers served for fixed terms of 16 years, creating experienced veterans who knew their trade thoroughly. They were paid regular wages, received shares of booty from successful campaigns, and could expect land grants upon retirement. Military service became a career rather than a civic obligation. The new legions were organized around cohorts of about 480 men each, replacing the old manipular system with more flexible tactical units. Each legionary carried a standardized kit including the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact, and the gladius, a short stabbing sword perfect for close combat. They were trained to build fortified camps every night, construct siege engines, and operate as engineers when necessary. Most importantly, Marius created professional loyalty that transcended traditional Roman institutions. Soldiers looked to their commanders for advancement, rewards, and retirement benefits rather than to the Senate or magistrates. This personal bond between generals and legions would have profound political consequences, as ambitious commanders discovered they could use their armies to advance their own interests. Marius's reforms worked brilliantly against the Germanic tribes. At Aquae Sextia and Vercellae, his professional legions destroyed the Cimbri and Teutonas, eliminating the immediate threat to Italy. But the long-term consequences of his changes would prove more dangerous to Roman institutions than any foreign enemy. Sulla's march on Rome, democracy takes a hit. In 88 BC, Lucius Cornelius Sulla did something unprecedented in Roman history. He marched on Rome with a Roman army to settle a political dispute. It was the moment when the Republic's civil institutions proved unable to contain the military forces they had created, beginning a century of civil wars that would eventually destroy Republican government entirely. The immediate cause was a quarrel over who should command the war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a wealthy king who had massacred thousands of Roman citizens in Asia Minor. The assembly had given the command to Marius, but Sulla, who was currently consul, believed the assignment rightfully belonged to him. When political negotiations failed, Sulla chose military solutions over civilian compromise. Most of Sulla's officers refused to participate in his march on Rome, considering it treasonous to use Roman legions against Roman citizens. But the common soldiers followed their commander, motivated by loyalty, promises of booty, and the simple fact that Sulla controlled their pay and promotions. The precedent was established. Roman armies would obey their generals rather than the Roman state when forced to choose. Sulla's occupation of Rome was brief but decisive. He outlawed his political enemies, reversed the assembly's decision about the Eastern Command, and demonstrated that force could trump constitutional procedure when backed by professional legions. Then he departed for his war against Mithridates, leaving Rome in the hands of politicians who had learned a disturbing lesson about power and violence. During Sulla's absence, his enemies regained control and began undoing his arrangements. Marius returned from exile and conducted bloody purges of Sulla's supporters, proving that political violence could flow in both directions. The cycle of revenge and counter-revenge was beginning, creating feuds that would poison Roman politics for generations. When Sulla returned to Italy in 83 BC, he brought his veterans and his eastern wealth to settle accounts with his enemies. The civil war that followed was more systematic and brutal than Rome's previous conflicts, introducing prescription lists that marked thousands of citizens for death. Republican institutions survived in form, but their substance was being hollowed out by commanders who preferred military solutions to political problems. The Mithridatic Wars and Eastern complications. Mithridates VI of Pontus was perhaps the most dangerous enemy Rome faced after Hannibal, a brilliant king who understood both Greek culture and barbarian warfare, who spoke 22 languages and had spent his youth building immunity to poison by taking small doses daily. He was also obsessed with driving Romans out of Asia Minor and restoring Greek independence, making him a natural focal point for anti-Roman sentiment throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The kingdom of Pontus sat along the southern shore of the Black Sea, controlling lucrative trade routes between Europe and Asia. Mithridates had expanded his territory through conquest and diplomacy, creating a powerful state that rivaled Rome's eastern provinces. He commanded diverse armies including Greek phalanxes, Scythian cavalry, and Celtic mercenaries, all united by their hatred of Roman rule. In 88 BC, Mithridates launched a coordinated assault on Roman power in Asia Minor. His agents had been secretly organizing resistance for years, promising freedom from Roman taxes and exploitation. When the revolt began, Romans and Italian merchants were massacred by the thousands in a single day, with local populations eagerly participating in the slaughter. It was ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, motivated by years of accumulated resentment. Roman response was complicated by the civil war between Marius and Sulla, with both commanders claiming the right to fight Mithridates. The Eastern War became entangled with domestic politics, as Mithridates skillfully exploited Roman divisions to strengthen his own position. He even negotiated with Roman rebels and offered support to anyone willing to oppose the Senate's authority. Sulla eventually secured the Eastern Command and spent several years systematically reconquering the lost territories. His methods were characteristically brutal, including the sack of Athens and massive indemnities imposed on cities that had supported Mithridates. The Greek world learned that rebellion against Rome carried a terrible price even when the rebellion initially succeeded. But Mithridates escaped to fight again, and his wars would continue intermittently for decades. He had demonstrated that Rome's eastern provinces were vulnerable to competent leadership and coordinated resistance. More ominously, he had shown how domestic Roman conflicts could be exploited by foreign enemies, a lesson that future opponents would remember when Rome faced its greatest internal crisis: Spartacus and the Slave Rebellion. In 73 BC, a group of gladiators broke out of their training school in Capua and began what would become the largest slave revolt in Roman history. Their leader was Spartacus, a Thracian who had served in the Roman army before being enslaved and forced to fight for entertainment. He understood both Roman military tactics and the desperate hopes of the millions of people held in bondage throughout Italy. The rebellion began with fewer than 100 escapees, but it grew rapidly as word spread through the slave populations of central and southern Italy. Runaway slaves brought weapons stolen from their masters, knowledge of local terrain, and burning hatred of the system that had destroyed their lives. Many were prisoners of war who retained their military skills and their desire for revenge against Roman conquest. Spartacus proved to be a gifted military commander who could weld this desperate rabble into an effective fighting force. His army adopted guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to their situation, avoiding pitched battles while raiding estates and recruiting new followers. They established camps in defensible positions and trained constantly, transforming field hands and household slaves into disciplined soldiers. Roman authorities initially underestimated the threat, sending small forces that were easily defeated by the growing slave army. Each Roman defeat brought more weapons and confidence to the rebels, while demonstrating to potential recruits that Romans could be beaten. The rebellion spread across southern Italy like wildfire, with entire regions falling under rebel control. The social implications terrified the Roman upper classes more than the military threat. The slavery was the foundation of Roman wealth and lifestyle, providing labour for everything from agriculture to household service. If slaves could successfully rebel and maintain their freedom, the entire economic system might collapse. Every Roman senator who owned hundreds of slaves suddenly wondered about the loyalty of his own household. Spartacus's strategic thinking was remarkably sophisticated for someone dismissed by Romans as a mere gladiator. He understood that his army needed to escape Italy entirely to survive long-term, and he negotiated with pirates to transport his forces to Sicily, where they could establish a permanent base. But the pirates betrayed him, stranding the slave army in Italy where they would have to face Rome's full military power. Pompey's rise to power and eastern conquests. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great, was the most successful Roman general of his generation and possibly the most overrated. He had a talent for arriving at the right moment to claim credit for other people's victories, combined with genuine organisational ability and political instincts that served him well in an age of ambitious strongmen. Pompey's career began during Sulla's civil war, where he raised private legions from his family's estates and clients. He was barely out of his teens, but already displayed the confidence and ruthlessness that would characterise his later campaigns. Sulla nicknamed him the Great as a sarcastic reference to Alexander the Great, but Pompey embraced the title and spent his life trying to live up to it. His first independent command came in Spain, where he spent several years finishing the war against Sertorius that other commanders had bungled. Pompey's methods combined military pressure with diplomatic corruption, gradually isolating the rebel leader until Spanish tribes abandoned their Roman ally. It wasn't glorious warfare, but it was effective, and it established Pompey's reputation for getting results. Returning to Italy in 71 BC, Pompey arrived just in time to help Marcus Crassus finish crushing Spartacus's slave rebellion. Although Crassus had done most of the fighting, Pompey managed to intercept and destroy the last group of escaped slaves, allowing him to claim he had ended the war. This ability to capitalize on fortunate timing would serve him throughout his career. The Senate reluctantly granted Pompey a triumph, and the consulship despite his youth and his tendency to ignore constitutional procedures. They had learned that it was easier to reward successful generals than to fight them, especially when those generals controlled loyal armies and had popular support. Pompey's rise demonstrated how military success could trump traditional political requirements. His greatest opportunity came with the command against Mediterranean pirates, who had grown so bold they were raiding Italian coasts and disrupting grain supplies to Rome. The Senate granted Pompey unprecedented powers to deal with the crisis, giving him command over the entire Mediterranean and unlimited resources. It was exactly the kind of sweeping authority that would allow an ambitious general to reshape the Roman world. The First Triumvirate, the Gang of Three. In 60 BC, three of Rome's most powerful men made a secret agreement that would control the Republic for the next decade. Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Crassus formed what historians call the First Triumvirate, though they preferred to call it a friendship. It was actually a criminal conspiracy to divide Roman offices and provinces among themselves, while excluding their political enemies from power. Caesar needed the consulship to advance his career and secure a profitable command that would make him wealthy enough to compete with his partners. Pompey wanted land grants for his eastern veterans, who had been waiting years for the Senate to fulfill promises made after their successful campaigns. Crassus sought a military command that would give him military glory to match his enormous wealth and political influence. The Senate had blocked all three men's ambitions through traditional political maneuvering, forcing them to work together despite their mutual distrust. Caesar was the negotiator who brought them together, recognizing that their combined resources could overwhelm any opposition. Pompey provided military prestige and veteran support, while Crassus contributed the vast wealth needed to buy votes and influence elections. Their arrangement was remarkably cynical but brutally effective. Caesar won the consulship and pushed through legislation granting Pompey's veterans their land and ratifying his eastern settlements. In return, Pompey supported Caesar's proposal to govern Gaul for 5 years with multiple legions, setting up the conquest that would make Caesar's fortune and reputation. Opposition senators like Cato the Younger recognized the threat to republican institutions, but they lacked the power to resist. Traditional constitutional procedures meant nothing when the three most powerful men in Rome were cooperating to subvert them. The triumvirate controlled elections, legislation, and military commands through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and popular appeal. The partnership worked smoothly at first, with each member getting what he wanted from Roman politics. But success bred ambition, and ambition bred conflict. Caesar's Gallic victories made him too successful, Crassus's eastern campaign made him too dead, and Pompey's jealousy made him too dangerous. The informal arrangement that had stabilized Roman politics was about to tear the Republic apart. Julius Caesar in Gaul, 8 years of conquest. In 58 BC, Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul as proconsul with 4 legions and unlimited ambition. He was 52 years old, deeply in debt, and politically vulnerable if he returned to Rome as a private citizen. The Gallic command offered him the chance to win military glory, capture enormous wealth, and build the kind of veteran loyalty that had made Pompey and Crassus so powerful. Gaul was a vast territory stretching from the Rhine to the Atlantic, inhabited by Celtic tribes who were wealthy, warlike, and completely disorganized. They had excellent metalworking skills, sophisticated agricultural techniques, and a warrior culture that emphasized individual courage over disciplined cooperation. They also had the unfortunate tendency to fight each other more than their common enemies. Caesar's genius lay in his ability to exploit Gallic divisions while presenting himself as a protector rather than a conqueror. He intervened in tribal disputes, supported friendly chiefs against their rivals, and gradually extended Roman influence through a combination of diplomacy and intimidation. Each intervention led to new commitments, and each commitment required further military action to maintain Roman credibility. The Helvetii migration gave Caesar his first major opportunity to demonstrate Roman power. When the Swiss tribe decided to migrate across Gaul to the Atlantic coast, Caesar claimed they threatened Roman allies and blocked their movement. The battle that followed showcased Roman military superiority and established Caesar's reputation as a general who could win decisive victories against overwhelming odds. Year after year, Caesar extended Roman control deeper into Gaul, fighting campaigns that stretched from Belgium to the English Channel. His commentaries on these wars, written in the third person with elegant prose, described his victories as inevitable consequences of Roman virtue and barbarian weakness. They were also brilliant political propaganda, keeping his name prominent in Roman politics while he was away fighting. The Gallic tribes gradually recognized their common danger, but their attempts at coordinated resistance came too late. Caesar had already divided them, conquered them separately, and built the veteran army that would soon march on Rome itself. In 8 years, he had conquered territory larger than Italy, captured millions of slaves, and amassed wealth that made him one of the richest men in the Mediterranean world. Caesar crosses the Rubicon. On a cold January night in 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood on the banks of a small river in northern Italy and made the decision that would end the Roman Republic. The Rubicon was the legal boundary between Gaul and Italy, and Roman law forbade any general from crossing it with armed forces. Caesar had 4 veteran legions behind him, and a choice that would determine the future of Mediterranean civilization. The crisis had been building for months as Caesar's enemies in Rome, led by Cato the Younger and supported by Pompey, demanded that he return as a private citizen to face prosecution for his illegal acts as consul. Caesar knew that without his imperium, his military command, he would be defenseless against his political enemies and their courts. His career would end in exile or execution, and his achievements would be forgotten. Caesar had tried negotiation, offering to dismiss most of his legions if he could keep just 2 and run for consul in absentia. The Senate rejected every compromise, perhaps because they genuinely feared his ambition or perhaps because they wanted to destroy him politically. Either way, they forced Caesar to choose between submission and revolution. His famous words, "Alaia iacta est," the die is cast, may have been spoken by historians rather than Caesar himself, but they captured the moment when Roman politics moved from legal procedures to military force. Once Caesar crossed that small river, there could be no return to constitutional government. Civil war was inevitable, and the Republic would not survive it. The irony was that Caesar crossed with only about 5,000 men, hardly an overwhelming force compared to the armies available to his enemies. But these were Gallic war veterans who had followed him through 8 years of constant campaigning. They were loyal to Caesar personally, confident in their own abilities, and eager for the rewards that victory would bring. Quality mattered more than quantity in Roman civil warfare. Caesar's march toward Rome was remarkably swift and bloodless. Italian towns opened their gates rather than resist his veterans, and Pompey's hastily assembled forces retreated without fighting. The great Pompey, who had never lost a campaign, found himself outmaneuvered by his former partner before the war had properly begun. The Civil War and Pompey's downfall. What followed was less a war between equals than extended chase across the Mediterranean, as Pompey tried to buy time while Caesar pursued him with relentless energy. Both men understood that this conflict would determine not just their personal fates, but the future structure of Roman government. The winner would inherit an empire, while the loser would be forgotten by history. Pompey's strategy was essentially defensive. He controlled the eastern provinces with their wealth and resources, commanded a powerful navy, and had time to train new legions while Caesar dealt with political problems in Rome. The plan was sensible in theory, but it underestimated Caesar's speed and his veterans' loyalty. Pompey also discovered that his eastern allies were less reliable than he had expected. Caesar moved with characteristic boldness, securing Rome, organizing the government, and then pursuing Pompey across the Adriatic Sea despite having an inferior navy. His legions marched and sailed with confidence born of 8 years of victory in Gaul, trusting their commander's judgment even when his plans seemed impossible. Caesar had built more than military units, he had created a military culture centered on personal loyalty and shared success. The decisive battle came at Phaselis in Greece in 48 BC, where Pompey finally agreed to fight despite having superior numbers and a strong position. Caesar's veterans proved their worth against Pompey's newer recruits, breaking the enemy line through disciplined ferocity that demoralized their opponents. Pompey fled the battlefield, his reputation shattered along with his army. Caesar's clemency toward defeated enemies was as calculated as his military tactics. Instead of executing captured senators and knights, he pardoned them and invited them to join his cause. This policy won him valuable support while demonstrating that he intended to heal rather than perpetuate civil conflicts. It was smart politics, though it would ultimately prove fatal to Caesar himself. Pompey's flight to Egypt ended in disaster when Ptolemy XIII's advisors decided to curry favor with Caesar by murdering his defeated rival. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he found Pompey's severed head waiting for him as a gift. Caesar's tears may have been genuine or theatrical, but his anger was real. The young king had deprived him of the chance to show clemency to his greatest enemy. Caesar in Egypt and Cleopatra's charm. Egypt in 48 BC was a kingdom in crisis, torn between the competing claims of the teenage Ptolemy XIII and his older sister Cleopatra VII. The siblings were married to each other, as was traditional in their dynasty, but they were also bitter enemies fighting for sole control of the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean. Caesar's arrival with his veteran legions tipped the balance in ways no one could have predicted. Cleopatra was 21 years old, highly educated, and desperate to regain the throne from which her brother had recently expelled her. She also understood that Caesar needed money to pay his troops and continue his civil war against the remaining supporters of Pompey. What began as a political alliance quickly became something more personal and historically significant. The famous story of Cleopatra being smuggled to Caesar wrapped in a carpet was probably invented by later historians, but it captures something important about their relationship. Both were intelligent, ambitious people who recognized each other's talents and needs. Caesar found a partner who could match his wit and provide the resources he needed, while Cleopatra found a protector who could secure her throne. Their affair scandalized Romans who viewed Egypt as a wealthy but decadent kingdom that represented everything corrupting about Eastern luxury. Caesar was supposed to be conquering foreign peoples, not consorting with foreign queens. The relationship also had political implications that threatened traditional Roman values and institutions. A Roman general was not supposed to father children with enemy royalty. Caesar spent the winter of 48-47 BC in Alexandria, enjoying Egyptian luxury while his enemies regrouped elsewhere. Critics later claimed he was distracted by love from his political duties, but Caesar was actually consolidating his control over Egypt's vast wealth and resources. The kingdom became a crucial source of funding for his continued campaigns. When he finally left Egypt in 47 BC, he left behind a strengthened Cleopatra, a son named Caesarion whose paternity he never officially acknowledged, and a relationship that would continue to influence Roman politics for decades. More immediately, he left Egypt as a Roman protectorate in all but name, adding its resources to his growing power base. The Ides of March and Caesar's assassination. By 44 BC, Julius Caesar had become the most powerful man in Roman history. He held the dictatorship, controlled all military forces, and was planning campaigns that would extend Roman power to the borders of India. He was also increasingly isolated from the senatorial class that had traditionally governed Rome, surrounded by flatterers and foreign advisors who encouraged his autocratic tendencies. The conspiracy against Caesar grew slowly, led by men like Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic from tyranny. Brutus was particularly important to the plot because of his ancestry. He claimed descent from the Brutus who had expelled the last king centuries earlier. His participation gave the conspiracy legitimacy in the eyes of Romans who still cherished republican traditions. Caesar had received numerous warnings about the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month that soothsayers had declared dangerous for him. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares about his death, and sacrificial animals showed unfavourable omens. But Caesar had survived decades of warfare and political intrigue, and he may have grown careless about personal security. He also suffered from epilepsy and other health problems that may have affected his judgment. The assassination took place in the theatre of Pompeii, where the Senate was meeting while their usual chamber was under renovation. The irony of Caesar being killed in a building named for his greatest enemy was not lost on contemporary observers. The conspirators had chosen the location carefully, believing that Pompey's ghost would approve of their actions. When Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, pierced by 23 wounds, the conspirators expected Romans to celebrate the return of freedom. Instead, they found a city in shock and a population that had grown accustomed to Caesar's rule. The man they had killed as a tyrant was mourned as a benefactor by common citizens who had received his largesse and land grants. The assassination solved nothing and created new problems. Caesar was dead, but Caesarism lived on in the ambitions of his followers and the expectations of his veterans. The conspirators had eliminated one dictator, only to discover that the conditions that had created him remained unchanged. The Second Triumvirate and proscription lists. In the chaos following Caesar's assassination, 3 men emerged to claim his political inheritance. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir, and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's master of horse. Unlike the secret alliance of the First Triumvirate, They formalized their partnership with legal authority to reconstitute the Roman state, which mainly meant hunting down and killing their enemies. The Second Triumvirate was established by the Lex Titia in November 43 BC, granting the three men dictatorial powers for 5 years. They divided the Roman world among themselves. Antonius took Gaul and the east, Octavian received Africa and Sardinia, while Lepidus got Spain and southern Gaul. More ominously, they drew up proscription lists naming their enemies for execution and confiscation of property. The proscriptions were systematic political murder on a scale that shocked even Romans accustomed to civil war violence. Senators, knights, and wealthy citizens found their names posted in the forum, marking them for death by bounty hunters who received rewards for severed heads. Families were destroyed, fortunes confiscated, and an entire generation of Roman leadership was eliminated to pay for the triumvirate's armies. Among the victims was Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and a fierce opponent of autocracy. Antonius demanded his death as the price for cooperation, despite Octavian's half-hearted protests. When Cicero's head and hands were displayed on the speaker's platform where he had delivered his greatest speeches, it symbolized the death of republican eloquence and constitutional government. The triumvirs justified their actions as necessary measures to restore order and punish Caesar's assassins, but their real purpose was to consolidate power and eliminate potential rivals. They understood that the Roman Republic could not survive another civil war, so they were replacing it with something new. Whether that something would be better or worse remained to be seen. With their domestic enemies eliminated and their treasuries filled with confiscated wealth, the triumvirs turned their attention to the remaining conspirators and republican forces gathering in the east. The final battles for the soul of Rome were about to begin, though the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Republic was already dead, only its funeral remained. Antony and Cleopatra's love story. Marcus Antonius was everything a Roman general was supposed to be. Tall, handsome, brave in battle, and popular with his soldiers. He was also prone to excess in all things, which made him perfect for Cleopatra when they finally met in 41 BC at Tarsus in Asia Minor. Their relationship would become one of history's great love stories, though it was built on political necessity as much as personal attraction. Cleopatra arrived for their first meeting in a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Venus and surrounded by beautiful attendants. It was theatrical, expensive, and calculated to impress a Roman who appreciated both luxury and spectacle. Antonius, who had been summoned to account for Egypt's lack of support during the recent civil wars, found himself completely enchanted by this display of wealth and sophistication. Their affair was as much about resources as romance. Cleopatra controlled the vast wealth of Egypt, including grain harvests that could feed Rome's population and gold mines that could fund armies. Antonius needed both to maintain his position as ruler of Rome's eastern provinces and compete with Octavian's growing power in the west. Marriage to the Egyptian queen made perfect political sense, but their relationship transcended mere calculation. Both were intelligent, cultured people who shared interests in literature, philosophy, and the arts. They established a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to magnificent banquets and elaborate entertainments that scandalized Roman moralists but created a genuine bond between the lovers and their followers. Roman propaganda, later amplified by Octavian's supporters, portrayed Antony as a Roman general corrupted by foreign luxury and enslaved by an Eastern temptress. The reality was more complex. Antony remained an effective military commander and competent administrator, while Cleopatra was a shrewd ruler who spoke 9 languages and governed Egypt successfully for nearly 2 decades. Their children together represented a new vision of Mediterranean civilization, one that blended Roman power with Hellenistic culture and Egyptian wealth. But this vision required defeating Octavian, and time was running out. The final confrontation between East and West, between the Old Republic and the New Empire, was approaching rapidly across the waters of the Aegean Sea. The Battle of Actium and Octavian's victory. September 2nd, 31 BC, dawned calm and clear over the Ambracian Gulf on the western coast of Greece. 2 fleets faced each other in what would be the last great naval battle of the ancient world, carrying with them the fate of Rome and the future of Mediterranean civilization. On one side stood Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra, with the wealth and traditions of the East. On the other waited Octavian and Marcus Agrippa, with the disciplined legions of the West. The campaign leading to Actium had been a masterpiece of logistics and psychology on Octavian's part. Instead of attacking Antony's eastern strongholds directly, he had lured his rival to the western coast of Greece and then systematically cut off his supply lines. Antony's massive army, stranded without adequate provisions, began to suffer from disease and desertion as the siege dragged on through the summer months. Antony's fleet was impressive, with enormous warships that towered over Octavian's smaller vessels. Some of his quinqueremes carried catapults and fought more like floating fortresses than traditional warships. But size brought disadvantages along with power, making his ships slower and less maneuverable than Agrippa's lighter galleys. The battle would test whether raw strength could overcome tactical flexibility. The engagement began with careful maneuvering as both fleets tried to gain advantageous positions. Antony attempted to break through Octavian's line and escape to Egypt with his treasures and remaining forces. But when Cleopatra's squadron suddenly withdrew from the battle, taking the Egyptian treasury with her, Antony's fleet began to collapse. Whether this was treachery, panic, or a prearranged signal has been debated ever since. Antony followed Cleopatra's retreat, abandoning his fleet and army to their fate. His remaining ships fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by Agrippa's superior tactics and fresher crews. By evening, Octavian controlled the sea, and Antony's land forces were surrendering en masse. The last hope of the Roman Republic died with the setting sun over the Ambracian Gulf. The victory at Actium made Octavian master of the Roman world, but it also left him with the enormous challenge of governing an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The institutions of the Republic were clearly inadequate for such a vast territory, but Romans remained suspicious of kings and emperors. Octavian would need all his political skill to create a new system that preserved republican traditions while establishing imperial authority. Augustus and the Principate illusion. When Octavian returned to Rome after his victory at Actium, he faced a problem that had destroyed Julius Caesar: how to rule an empire while maintaining the fiction of republican government. Romans hated kings but needed strong leadership. They treasured their constitutional traditions but recognized that those traditions couldn't govern a Mediterranean-wide empire. Octavian's solution was brilliant, cynical and successful. In 27 BC, he formally returned all his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome, declaring the Republic restored and the civil wars finally ended. It was political theatre of the highest quality, carefully staged to demonstrate his republican virtue and selfless devotion to Roman traditions. The grateful Senate immediately begged him to continue serving as their leader, granting him new powers and the honorary name Augustus. The Principate, as historians call Augustus's system, preserved republican institutions while neutering their real power. The Senate continued to meet and debate, magistrates were elected annually, and citizens could vote in assemblies. But Augustus controlled the armies, the provinces, and the treasury, making all important decisions while allowing others to maintain their dignity through meaningless ceremonial roles. Augustus was careful never to call himself emperor, preferring the title princeps, meaning first citizen. He lived modestly, at least by royal standards, and made a show of consulting the Senate on important matters. His house on the Palatine Hill was elegant but not ostentatious, and he dressed like a wealthy senator rather than an oriental potentate. The illusion of republican government required constant maintenance. The system worked because Augustus was genuinely competent at governing and because Romans were exhausted by decades of civil war. He provided peace, prosperity, and effective administration in exchange for political obedience. Citizens could pursue their careers and businesses without fear of proscription lists or confiscations. The price was freedom, but most Romans considered it a bargain worth making. Augustus ruled for over 40 years, long enough to establish precedents that would guide the empire for centuries. He created a professional civil service, reorganized the army, beautified Rome with magnificent buildings, and extended Roman citizenship to deserving provincials. When he died in 14 AD at age 75, he had transformed a chaotic republic into a stable empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's security problem. One of Augustus's most consequential decisions was the creation of the Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit tasked with protecting the emperor and maintaining order in Rome. These soldiers were better paid than regular legionaries, served shorter terms, and enjoyed the prestige that came with guarding the ruler of the known world. They were also positioned to determine who that ruler would be, making them the most dangerous men in the empire. The Guard initially consisted of 9 cohorts totaling about 4,500 men, recruited from Italian citizens rather than provincial auxiliaries. Augustus wanted protectors who shared Roman values and had personal stakes in the empire's stability. They were housed in barracks throughout the city rather than concentrated in a single location, presumably to prevent them from becoming too powerful or independent. Under Augustus, the Praetorians functioned much as intended, providing security and ceremonial presence without interfering in politics. Their prefects were experienced officers chosen for loyalty and competence, not ambition. The emperor maintained careful control over their activities, ensuring they remained servants rather than kingmakers. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention. But the very existence of an armed guard in Rome violated republican traditions that had forbidden weapons within the city limits. The Praetorians represented the militarization of Roman politics, the final acknowledgement that the empire rested on force rather than consent. Their presence reminded everyone that Augustus ruled through strength, however much he might disguise that fact with constitutional niceties. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, made the fatal mistake of concentrating the Guard in a single fortress, the Castra Praetoria, under the command of the ambitious Sejanus. This gave the Praetorians corporate identity and political influence that would plague future emperors. Sejanus used his position to manipulate access to the emperor and eliminate potential rivals, demonstrating how bodyguards could become puppeteers. Future emperors would discover that the Praetorian Guard was a double-edged sword that could cut both ways. They provided essential protection in a world full of ambitious generals and senatorial conspirators, but they also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies. No emperor could rule without them, but ruling with them required skills that not all rulers possessed. Tiberius and the Reluctant Emperor. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he left the empire to his stepson Tiberius, a competent general and administrator who had never wanted to be emperor. Tiberius was 54 years old, experienced in government and warfare, but also bitter about the personal sacrifices his imperial destiny had required. His reign would demonstrate both the strengths and weaknesses of the Augustan system when operated by a capable but reluctant ruler. Tiberius had been Augustus's second choice for succession, elevated only after the early deaths of more favoured candidates. He had been forced to divorce his beloved wife Vipsania to marry Augustus's difficult daughter Julia, a political match that brought him no happiness and considerable scandal. When he finally became emperor, he carried decades of accumulated resentment about his personal losses and public obligations. The new emperor's competence was never in question. He maintained Augustus's policies, governed the provinces effectively, and kept the empire's finances in excellent condition. He was particularly skilled at foreign relations, managing to avoid expensive wars while maintaining Roman prestige through diplomacy and strategic intimidation. The empire prospered under his administration, even as Romans grew to dislike their ruler personally. Tiberius's problems were temperamental rather than political. He was naturally suspicious, intellectually arrogant, and socially awkward, qualities that made him ineffective at the ceremonial aspects of imperial leadership. He hated the games and public spectacles that Romans expected from their rulers, preferring to spend his time with books and a few close friends rather than courting popular opinion. The emperor's relationship with the Senate was particularly problematic. Tiberius genuinely tried to restore senatorial authority and involve senators in important decisions, but his manner was condescending and his temper was short. Senators felt patronized rather than respected, while Tiberius grew frustrated with what he saw as their incompetence and servility. Neither side understood what the other wanted. In 26 AD, Tiberius made the decision that would define his reign and damage his reputation forever. He withdrew to the island of Capri and refused to return to Rome. For the last 11 years of his rule, he governed the empire through correspondence while living in self-imposed exile, leaving the capital in the hands of subordinates whose ambitions would soon threaten the imperial system itself. Caligula's brief reign of madness. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Romans welcomed his young grandnephew Gaius with relief and enthusiasm. The new emperor had grown up in military camps, earning the nickname Caligula from the little soldier's boots he wore as a child. At 24, he seemed to represent everything Tiberius had not: youth, energy, and genuine affection for the Roman people. His reign began with spectacular games, generous bonuses, and promises to restore the dignity of imperial rule. For the first few months, Caligula appeared to be everything Romans had hoped for. He recalled political exiles, completed public works projects that Tiberius had abandoned, and staged magnificent entertainments that delighted the crowds. His generosity extended to the Praetorian Guard, the legions, and even the urban mob, creating goodwill throughout the empire. Romans began to forget their complaints about the imperial system. But something went wrong in Caligula's mind, whether from illness, stress, or some deeper psychological flaw that absolute power revealed. By his second year as emperor, he was behaving in ways that shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial eccentricity. He declared himself a living god, demanded worship from senators, and conducted elaborate conversations with statues of Jupiter as if they were old friends. His cruelties became increasingly random and elaborate. He forced senators to run beside his chariot for miles, appointed his horse Incitator as a consul, and staged gladiatorial games where the audience was thrown to wild beasts when he grew bored with the regular entertainment. What had begun as imperial caprice evolved into systematic terror that made even the Praetorian Guard nervous about their emperor's stability. Caligula's foreign policy was equally erratic. He planned to invade Britain, but instead ordered his soldiers to collect seashells on the beach as spoils of war against Neptune. He built a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, demonstrating his superiority to the legendary conqueror. These expensive spectacles depleted the treasury that Tiberius had so carefully maintained. By 41 AD, conspiracies were forming among senators, freedmen, and even Praetorian officers who recognized that Caligula's madness threatened the entire imperial system. The emperor, who had once seemed like salvation, had become the empire's greatest liability, and everyone understood that something would have to be done before his insanity destroyed Rome itself. Claudius and the Unexpected Good Emperor. The assassination of Caligula in January 41 AD left the empire without clear succession plans, and the Praetorian Guard searching the palace for surviving members of the imperial family. They found Claudius, Caligula's 50-year-old uncle, hiding behind a curtain in terror. The guards proclaimed him emperor, more or less by accident, since he was the only adult male, Julian, available, and they needed someone to legitimize their action. It seemed like a desperate expedient that wouldn't last long. Claudius appeared to be the least likely candidate for successful rule. He limped, stammered, drooled when excited, and had been considered an embarrassment by his own family for decades. Augustus and Tiberius had kept him away from public ceremonies, believing his physical disabilities would diminish imperial dignity. Even his mother described him as a monster of a man, not finished but merely begun by nature. But appearances deceived everyone, including probably Claudius himself. Beneath his ungainly exterior was a sharp intellect, a genuine scholar who had written histories of the Etruscans and Carthaginians and had studied constitutional law extensively. His physical weaknesses had actually protected him during the dangerous reigns of Tiberius and Caligula, since no one had considered him a political threat worth eliminating. As emperor, Claudius proved remarkably effective at administration and surprisingly willing to innovate. He expanded Roman citizenship to deserving provincials, reformed the legal system, and undertook massive public works projects including new aqueducts and the expansion of Rome's harbour at Ostia. He also conquered Britain, something that even Julius Caesar had failed to accomplish permanently. His greatest insight was recognizing that the empire needed professional administrators rather than aristocratic amateurs. Claudius relied heavily on educated freedmen like Narcissus and Pallas, men who understood bureaucracy and could implement complex policies efficiently. This scandalized senators who believed government should be restricted to the traditional elite, but it worked remarkably well in practice. Claudius ruled for 13 years, longer than Augustus had originally expected when he established the Principate. He proved that competence mattered more than dignity in imperial government, and that Rome's strength lay in its ability to adapt and incorporate new people and ideas. His success also demonstrated that the imperial system could survive almost any crisis if the emperor was genuinely committed to serving the empire's interests rather than his own ego. The Great Fire of Rome and Nero's response. On the night of July 18, 64 AD, fire broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus and quickly spread through Rome's densely packed neighborhoods. The blaze burned for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming 10 of the city's 14 districts and leaving hundreds of thousands of Romans homeless. It was the worst disaster in the city's history, and it occurred during the reign of an emperor whose reputation would never recover from the crisis. Nero was not, despite popular belief, playing his fiddle while Rome burned. The fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years, and Nero was actually in Antium, 30 miles from the city, when the fire started. When news reached him, he rushed back to Rome and took energetic measures to fight the flames and care for the displaced population. His response was actually quite competent, though that wouldn't matter to his historical reputation. The emperor organised firefighting efforts, opened public buildings and his own gardens to refugees, and arranged for emergency food supplies to be brought from nearby towns. He also began planning the reconstruction of Rome with wider streets, better building materials, and improved fire prevention measures. It was one of the most effective disaster responses in ancient history, but it couldn't overcome the political damage from what happened next. To fund the massive reconstruction project, Nero imposed heavy taxes throughout the empire and began confiscating property from wealthy citizens suspected of disloyalty. He also seized the opportunity to build his enormous Golden House, a palace complex that covered over 100 acres in the heart of the city. Romans watched their emperor construct a monument to his own vanity while they struggled to rebuild their homes and businesses. Rumours began circulating that Nero had started the fire himself to clear land for his architectural projects. The stories were almost certainly false, but they reflected popular anger about his priorities and spending. When the emperor blamed the fire on a small religious sect called Christians and began executing them in grotesque public spectacles, it only reinforced his reputation for cruelty and poor judgment. The fire marked the beginning of Nero's downfall, though it would take 4 more years for the consequences to fully unfold. Romans had lost faith in their emperor's competence and character, and faith was the only thing that maintained imperial authority. Without it, even the most powerful ruler in the world could find himself surprisingly vulnerable to ambitious generals and angry populations. The Year of 4 Emperors. The year 69 AD was one of the most chaotic in Roman history, as 4 different men claimed the imperial purple and civil war erupted across the empire. It demonstrated that the Augustan settlement, which had brought nearly a century of relative stability, was only as strong as the emperor's ability to command loyalty from the armies and respect from the population. When both failed simultaneously, the empire nearly tore itself apart. The crisis began with Nero's suicide in June 68 AD, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled since Augustus. The Senate proclaimed Servius Sulpicius Galba emperor, an elderly governor from Spain who had the support of the Western legions but little understanding of Roman politics. Galba's immediate mistake was refusing to pay the Praetorian Guard the bonus they expected for supporting his claim to power. On January 15, 69 AD, the Praetorians murdered Galba in the Forum and proclaimed Marcus Salvius Otho emperor. Otho had been one of Nero's friends and had supported Galba's rebellion, but he was also ambitious and frustrated by his limited role in the new government. His reign lasted only 3 months before he faced a more serious challenger from the Rhine frontier. Aulus Vitellius commanded the powerful German legions, veterans who were well-trained, well-equipped and devoted to their commander. When news of Galba's death reached the Rhine, they proclaimed Vitellius emperor and began marching toward Rome. The ensuing civil war was brief but destructive, ending with Otho's suicide and Vitellius's entry into the capital as the year's 3rd emperor. But Vitellius's triumph was short-lived. The Eastern legions, led by Titus Flavius Vespasianus, refused to recognize his authority and proclaimed their own candidate. Vespasian was a competent general from a modest background who had been conducting the siege of Jerusalem when the crisis began. Unlike the previous contenders, he had both military strength and administrative experience, along with support from Egypt's grain supplies. The final conflict of the year saw Vespasian's supporters capture Rome while Vitellius barricaded himself in the imperial palace. The emperor was dragged from his hiding place and killed in the streets, ending the year of chaos with a new dynasty in power. Romans had learned that civil war remained possible even under the imperial system, but they had also discovered that competent leadership could restore order relatively quickly when the right man emerged. The Flavian Dynasty and practical rule. Vespasian's victory in 69 AD brought a new kind of emperor to power, one who combined military competence with middle-class practicality and a healthy sense of humour about the absurdities of absolute rule. The Flavian Dynasty, consisting of Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, would govern Rome for 27 years and establish precedents that influenced imperial administration for centuries. Vespasian was the first emperor to come from outside the old aristocracy, rising through military merit and administrative competence rather than birth or adoption into the imperial family. His father had been a tax collector, his mother came from a family of centurions, and he himself had served competently but not brilliantly in Britain and Judea before the Civil War elevated him to supreme power. The new emperor's greatest asset was his practical understanding of how government actually worked. Unlike his predecessors, who had often been distracted by constitutional theory or personal vanity, Vespasian focused on concrete problems like imperial finances, military organization, and provincial administration. He raised taxes where necessary, cut expenses where possible, and made decisions based on effectiveness rather than tradition. Vespasian also displayed a refreshing lack of pretension about his position. When senators approached him with excessive flattery, he responded with jokes rather than encouragement. On his deathbed, he supposedly quipped, "I think I'm becoming a god," mocking the official deification that awaited deceased emperors. His humour helped diffuse the tensions between emperor and aristocracy that had plagued earlier reigns. His building program reflected the same practical priorities. The Colosseum, begun during his reign and completed under his son Titus, was designed to provide spectacular entertainment for Rome's population while demonstrating imperial power to foreign visitors. It was propaganda architecture, but it was also genuinely useful for maintaining public order and imperial prestige. The Flavian approach to imperial rule emphasized competence over charisma, effectiveness over elegance. They governed the empire like a family business, with clear chains of authority, careful attention to finances, and promotion based on merit rather than favoritism. It was less inspiring than Augustan grandeur or Neronian spectacle, but it was also more sustainable over the long term. Trajan and the empire's greatest expansion. Marcus Ulpius Traianus was the first emperor born outside Italy, a Spanish aristocrat whose reign from 98 to 113 AD would expand Roman power to its greatest territorial extent. Trajan combined the military skills that had made Rome dominant with an engineer's passion for grand projects and a politician's understanding of what made Romans happy. He was also the last emperor who believed that conquest could solve the empire's fundamental problems. Trajan's first major campaign targeted Dacia, the wealthy kingdom north of the Danube ruled by King Decebalus. The Dacians had humiliated Roman armies during Domitian's reign and extracted tribute from the empire, a situation that Trajan found intolerable. His two Dacian wars, fought between 101 and 6 AD, demonstrated Roman military engineering at its finest, including the construction of a massive stone bridge across the Danube that amazed contemporary observers. The conquest of Dacia brought enormous wealth into Roman hands, including access to gold mines that helped fund Trajan's building projects for decades. The emperor celebrated with games lasting 123 days, featuring 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals. It was conspicuous consumption on an imperial scale, but it also demonstrated Roman power to audiences throughout the Mediterranean world, who understood that only the strongest rulers could afford such extravagance. Trajan's eastern campaigns were even more ambitious, targeting the Parthian Empire that had been Rome's primary rival for over a century. In 1113 AD, he invaded Armenia and Mesopotamia, capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon and advancing to the Persian Gulf. For a brief moment, Roman eagles flew over territories that Alexander the Great had conquered 4 centuries earlier, fulfilling dreams of Mediterranean unity under Roman rule. But Trajan's conquests proved impossible to maintain. The new provinces were too distant from Roman supply bases, too culturally alien to accept Roman rule willingly, and too expensive to garrison effectively. Rebellions erupted behind his advancing armies, while Parthian counterattacks threatened his overextended lines of communication. The emperor, who had expanded Roman power to its limits, discovered that limits existed for good reasons. Trajan died in 1117 AD, while returning from his eastern campaigns, leaving his successor the difficult task of deciding which conquests to retain and which to abandon. His reign had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of Roman expansion, proving that military genius and unlimited resources could push the empire's boundaries farther than ever before, but not necessarily farther than they should go. Hadrian's wall and travel obsession. Publius Aelius Hadrianus was everything Trajan was not. Intellectual rather than military, cautious rather than aggressive, and fascinated by Greek culture rather than Roman tradition. When he became emperor in 1117 AD, his first decision was to abandon most of Trajan's eastern conquests, recognizing that the empire needed consolidation rather than further expansion. It was a wise choice that probably saved Roman civilization, though it disappointed Romans who had grown accustomed to constant victory. Hadrian spent more than half his 21-year reign travelling throughout the empire, personally inspecting fortifications, reviewing troops, founding cities, and settling administrative problems that required imperial attention. No previous emperor had shown such hands-on interest in provincial affairs, and none had possessed the intellectual curiosity that drove Hadrian to study local customs, languages, and architectural traditions wherever he went. His most famous project was the wall that bears his name, stretching 73 miles across northern Britain from the Tyne to the Solway Firth. Hadrian's wall was both military fortification and political statement, demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities while acknowledging that even Roman power had limits. The Caledonians north of the wall would remain unconquered, but they would also remain contained by Roman military might. The wall itself was an impressive feat of engineering and organisation, requiring the labour of 3 legions working for several years to complete. It incorporated natural terrain features, included numerous forts and signal towers, and was supplied by an extensive road network that allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies. It was also beautiful in its way, built from carefully fitted stones that created clean lines across the rolling landscape of northern England. Hadrian's travels reflected his conviction that the empire's strength lay in its diversity rather than its uniformity. He encouraged local traditions, supported regional architecture, and promoted talented provincials to important positions in imperial administration. His approach was cosmopolitan rather than narrowly Roman, recognizing that the empire's future depended on successfully integrating different peoples and cultures. But Hadrian's intellectual interest sometimes created political problems. His attempt to found a Roman city on the ruins of Jerusalem, combined with his prohibition of circumcision, triggered the Bar Kokhba revolt that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and enormous resources. Even philosopher emperors could make catastrophic mistakes when they misunderstood the depth of religious and cultural attachments that their policies threatened. The Antonine Plague and Marcus Aurelius. Around 1605 AD, Roman legions returning from campaigns in the east brought with them an invisible enemy that would prove more dangerous than any barbarian tribe or foreign kingdom. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox or measles, spread rapidly throughout the empire, killing millions of people and weakening the imperial system just when external pressures were beginning to mount along the frontiers. The plague struck during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who had never wanted political power, but had accepted it as a duty imposed by fate and his adoptive father Antoninus Pius. Marcus was trained in Stoic philosophy, believing that virtue consisted of accepting whatever the gods decreed while working diligently to fulfill one's obligations. The plague would test these beliefs more severely than any philosophical debate. Epidemic disease was devastating in the ancient world, where medical knowledge was limited, and population density in cities created ideal conditions for transmission. The plague killed rich and poor alike, disrupting trade, reducing agricultural production, and weakening the military manpower that defended the empire's extensive frontiers. Some scholars estimate that it killed between 5 and 10% of the empire's total population. Marcus Aurelius faced the crisis with characteristic determination, personally leading armies against Germanic tribes who were pressing against the Danube frontier, while simultaneously trying to manage the plague's effects on imperial administration. His meditations, written in Greek while campaigning along the frontier, reflect a mind grappling with massive responsibilities while maintaining philosophical equanimity in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The emperor's Stoic training helped him cope with personal losses, including the deaths of several children and his beloved wife Faustina, but it couldn't solve the practical problems that the plague created. Imperial revenues declined as agricultural production fell, military recruitment became more difficult as populations shrank, and provincial administration grew more challenging as experienced officials died and couldn't be easily replaced. Marcus ruled for nearly 20 years from 1601 to 180 AD, spending most of that time dealing with military crises and administrative challenges that would have tested any ruler. His philosophical writings reveal a man who maintained his principles despite enormous pressure, but they also show the strain of trying to govern an empire that was beginning to face problems too large for any individual to solve, no matter how wise or dedicated. Commodus and the beginning of the end. When Marcus Aurelius died in 1800 AD, he broke the Antonine tradition of adopting capable successors and instead left the empire to his biological son Commodus. This decision, perhaps motivated by natural paternal affection or concern about civil war, would prove catastrophic for imperial government and begin the long decline that would eventually destroy the Western Empire. Lucius Aurelius Commodus was 19 years old when he became emperor. Handsome, athletic, and completely uninterested in the administrative duties that had consumed his father's life. Where Marcus had been philosophical and dutiful, Commodus was hedonistic and irresponsible. Where his father had spent years campaigning on dangerous frontiers, Commodus preferred the entertainments and luxuries available in Rome. The new emperor's passion was gladiatorial combat, which he practiced obsessively and performed publicly to the horror of senatorial observers who considered such activities beneath imperial dignity. Commodus fought as a gladiator hundreds of times, always winning because no one dared defeat the emperor, and charged the imperial treasury enormous fees for these performances. It was government by circus, funded by taxation, and managed by freedmen and favourites. Commodus also developed messianic delusions, identifying himself with the god Hercules and renaming Rome Commodiana in his own honour. He appeared in public wearing lion skins and carrying clubs, commissioned statues showing himself as the divine hero, and demanded worship from subjects who found his behaviour increasingly bizarre and frightening. The Antonine tradition of modest philosophical leadership died with Marcus Aurelius. The emperor's neglect of military and administrative affairs had serious consequences for imperial security and efficiency. Germanic tribes resumed their pressure on the Danube frontier. Provincial governors governed without imperial oversight, and the imperial bureaucracy grew corrupt and ineffective. Commodus cared nothing for these problems as long as his games and spectacles continued without interruption. By 902 AD, conspiracies were forming among senators, Praetorian prefects, and even imperial household members who recognized that Commodus's incompetence threatened the entire system. The emperor, who had inherited the most stable and prosperous empire in Roman history, had managed to undermine it through 12 years of neglect and self-indulgence. His assassination would end the Antonine Dynasty and begin the crisis that would nearly destroy Roman civilization. The crisis of the 3rd century begins. The murder of Commodus on December 31st, 902 AD, inaugurated what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of military anarchy, economic collapse and political fragmentation that brought Roman civilization to the brink of extinction. The crisis demonstrated that the Augustan system, which had provided stability for nearly 2 centuries, could not survive the combination of external pressure, internal rebellion, and incompetent leadership that characterized this dark period. The immediate aftermath of Commodus's death repeated the chaos of 69 AD, with multiple claimants fighting for imperial power while the empire's frontiers came under increasing pressure from barbarian tribes and aggressive neighbours. Septimius Severus eventually emerged victorious from this civil war, founding a new dynasty that would rule for several decades, but the damage to imperial prestige and military strength was severe. Severus was a capable military commander from North Africa who understood that the empire's survival depended on maintaining the loyalty of the legions regardless of the cost to civilian government or traditional institutions. His deathbed advice to his sons was revealing: enrich the soldiers, despise everyone else. It was practical politics for a militarized age, but it represented the final abandonment of the Augustan balance between military and civilian authority. The Severan dynasty managed to maintain imperial unity through military competence and generous payments to the armies. But their policies created new problems even as they solved old ones. Military expenses consumed ever larger portions of imperial revenue, forcing emperors to debase the currency and raise taxes to levels that crippled economic productivity and popular support for the government. External pressures also intensified during this period, as Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube frontiers grew more organized and aggressive. While the revived Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty posed unprecedented threats to Roman positions in the east, the empire faced a two-front war against enemies who had learned to exploit Roman weaknesses and coordinate their attacks. By the mid-3rd century, the imperial system was approaching total breakdown. Emperors were made and unmade by their armies. Provinces declared independence under local strongmen, and barbarian tribes penetrated deep into imperial territory without effective resistance. The Roman world that had seemed so stable under the Antonines was dissolving into chaos, and no one knew whether anything could save it from complete collapse. 50 emperors in 50 years. The period from 2035 to 2084 AD witnessed the near-complete collapse of imperial authority as the Roman Empire endured what historians call the military anarchy. During these 50 chaotic years, approximately 50 different men claimed the title of emperor, most ruling for only months before being murdered by rivals, assassinated by their own troops, or killed in battle against barbarian invaders or usurping generals. The crisis began with the assassination of Alexander Severus in 2035 AD by his own soldiers, who were frustrated with his attempts to negotiate peace with Germanic tribes rather than fight them. The Praetorian Guard proclaimed Maximinus Thrax emperor, a giant of a man from the Balkans who had risen through the ranks based on physical strength and military competence rather than aristocratic connections or political skill. Maximinus ruled through pure military force, never setting foot in Rome during his 3-year reign, and governing the empire from army camps along the northern frontiers. His policies were simple: fight the barbarians, tax the provinces, and execute anyone who questioned his authority. It was effective in the short term, but ultimately unsustainable, as the empire's resources were exhausted by constant warfare and administrative chaos. The emperor's reign ended when the Senate declared him a public enemy and supported a rival claimant, leading to civil war that devastated Italy and North Africa. Maximinus was eventually killed by his own troops, who had grown tired of his harsh discipline and the constant fighting his policies required. His death solved nothing, as new claimants immediately emerged to continue the cycle of violence. What followed was a kaleidoscope of short-lived rulers, each representing different interest groups and geographical regions that were losing faith in central authority. The Gallic Empire broke away from Roman control, Spain and Britain declared independence under local strongmen, and eastern provinces fell to Persian invasions while emperors fought each other for control of Italy. The traditional sources of imperial legitimacy had completely broken down. The Senate was ignored or intimidated, the Praetorian Guard sold their support to the highest bidder, and the legions followed generals who promised them the richest rewards rather than the most legitimate claims. The empire had become a prize to be won through violence rather than a trust to be administered through law. Diocletian and the Tetrarchy solution. In 2084 AD, a remarkable man from Dalmatia named Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus seized power and began the most comprehensive reorganization of Roman government since Augustus established the principate. Diocletian understood that the empire had grown too large and complex for any single ruler to govern effectively, and his solution was as radical as it was practical: divide imperial authority among 4 emperors who could coordinate their efforts while managing different regions. The Tetrarchy, as historians call Diocletian's system, consisted of 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior partners called Caesars. Each ruler controlled specific territories and armies, while maintaining loyalty to the overall imperial structure. Diocletian retained supreme authority as senior Augustus, but his partners were genuine co-emperors rather than mere subordinates or representatives. This division of power solved several critical problems simultaneously. Multiple emperors could respond more quickly to military threats along different frontiers, reducing the time needed to move armies from one crisis to another. It also reduced the incentive for provincial commanders to rebel, since they faced multiple imperial armies rather than a single overstretched force. Most importantly, it provided for orderly succession by promoting Caesars to Augustus rank when their seniors retired or died. Diocletian also implemented sweeping administrative and military reforms designed to strengthen imperial control over the provinces. He separated civil and military commands, preventing provincial governors from using local armies to support rebellion. He expanded the bureaucracy, creating professional administrators who owed their careers to imperial favor rather than local connections. He also reformed the tax system, requiring payments in goods rather than debased currency. The emperor's most controversial innovation was systematic persecution of Christianity, which he viewed as a disloyal foreign superstition that undermined traditional Roman values and imperial authority. The Great Persecution, beginning in 303 AD, aimed to force Christians to sacrifice to the traditional gods or face imprisonment, torture, and execution. It was the most severe religious persecution in Roman history, but it would also be the last. Diocletian's reforms succeeded in stabilizing the empire and ending the military anarchy, but at the cost of transforming Roman government into something more resembling an Oriental despotism than a Mediterranean republic. The princeps had become dominus. The first citizen had become lord and master. Roman traditions survived in form, but their substance had changed forever. Constantine and the Christian Revolution. The most consequential emperor since Augustus was born around 272 AD in the provincial town of Nisus, in what is now Serbia. Flavius Valerius Constantinus would become known to history as Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor who transformed both Roman government and Christian religion through his remarkable 40-year career as soldier, politician, and religious revolutionary. Constantine's rise to power followed the collapse of Diocletian's tetrarchy, as the four emperors and their successors fought each other for supreme authority, despite the system's careful provisions for peaceful succession. By 312 AD, Constantine controlled Gaul and Britain, while his rival Maxentius held Italy and North Africa. Their conflict would be decided at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, in a battle that changed the course of world history. According to later Christian sources, Constantine experienced a vision before the battle, seeing a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether the vision was genuine religious experience, political calculation, or later propaganda, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields and standards. His victory at Milvian Bridge was complete, and Maxentius drowned while fleeing across the collapsing bridge. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted religious toleration throughout the empire, ending centuries of sporadic persecution and allowing Christians to worship openly for the first time. Constantine went further, actively supporting Christian churches with generous donations, exempting Christian clergy from taxation, and involving himself directly in theological disputes that divided the growing Christian community. The emperor's conversion was probably gradual rather than sudden, motivated by genuine religious conviction combined with shrewd political calculation. Christianity was growing rapidly throughout the empire, particularly among urban populations and military units. By supporting the church, Constantine gained access to an organized network of supporters who could help him govern an increasingly diverse and fragmented society. Constantine's greatest innovation was the founding of Constantinople in 330 AD, a new capital built on the site of ancient Byzantium that would serve as the eastern seat of Roman power for over 1,000 years. The city was consciously designed as a Christian Rome, decorated with churches rather than temples, and populated by Christian administrators rather than pagan aristocrats. It represented the future of Roman civilization, though few contemporaries understood the implications of what Constantine had created. The Council of Nicaea and religious politics. In 325 AD, Constantine faced his first major crisis as a Christian emperor, when theological disputes threatened to tear apart the church he was trying to support. The controversy centered on the teachings of Arius, a priest from Alexandria who argued that Christ was subordinate to God the Father and therefore not truly divine. This seemingly abstract theological question had practical political implications that could destabilize the entire empire. Arianism, as the heresy came to be called, was popular among many bishops and had strong support in the eastern provinces, where Greek philosophical traditions made theological subtleties particularly important to educated Christians. If the church split over this issue, Constantine would lose a valuable tool for imperial unity and face the prospect of religious civil war alongside the military conflicts that already plagued the empire. Constantine's solution was characteristically bold and practical. Summon bishops from throughout the empire to a great council that would settle the controversy through collective deliberation and imperial authority. The Council of Nicaea brought together over 300 bishops from across the known world, the largest gathering of Christian leaders in the religion's history, and a clear demonstration of the emperor's commitment to church unity. The council's debates were passionate and occasionally violent, as bishops who had recently emerged from persecution now found themselves arguing about the fundamental nature of divine reality. Constantine presided over the sessions personally, despite his limited theological knowledge, using his political skills to guide the bishops toward consensus while maintaining imperial dignity and authority. The Nicene Creed, affirming that Christ was true God and true man and of one substance with the Father, became the orthodox Christian position and remains central to most Christian churches today. The council also established precedents for imperial involvement in church affairs that would influence both Roman government and Christian theology for centuries to come. But the Council of Nicaea solved the immediate crisis only temporarily. Arianism continued to flourish, particularly among the Germanic tribes who were converting to Christianity, and the relationship between imperial authority and religious truth remained problematic. Constantine had made Christianity the empire's favoured religion, but he had also made the emperor responsible for defining Christian doctrine, creating tensions that would plague both church and state for generations. Julian the Apostate's pagan revival. When Flavius Claudius Julianus became emperor in 361 AD, he inherited an empire that had been officially Christian for nearly 50 years. But Julian had different ideas about religion, philosophy, and the proper relationship between Roman government and divine authority. His brief reign would be the last serious attempt to restore traditional Roman religion and reverse the Christian revolution that Constantine had initiated. Julian had been raised as a Christian but educated in classical philosophy, rhetoric and literature that exposed him to the intellectual traditions of pagan antiquity. He found Greek philosophy more compelling than Christian theology, preferring Platonic metaphysics to biblical revelation and classical virtue ethics to Christian moral teachings. His conversion to paganism was apparently gradual and carefully concealed until he gained supreme power. As emperor, Julian moved quickly to reverse his Christian predecessors' religious policies. He withdrew imperial support from Christian churches, recalled pagan priests from exile, and reopened temples that had been closed or converted to Christian use. He also attempted to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, hoping to disprove Christian claims that its destruction fulfilled biblical prophecy, though the project was abandoned after mysterious fires and earthquakes discouraged the workers. Julian's reforms went beyond mere restoration of traditional practices. He attempted to create a organized pagan church that could compete with Christianity's institutional advantages, appointing high priests, establishing charitable foundations, and writing theological treatises that defended polytheism against Christian criticism. It was an impressive intellectual effort, but it came too late to reverse Christianity's growing dominance. The emperor also tried to undermine Christian influence through more subtle means, such as forbidding Christian teachers from instructing students in classical literature on the grounds that they couldn't sincerely teach texts celebrating gods they considered demons. This policy backfired by uniting Christians against imperial persecution and demonstrating Julian's intolerance despite his claims to support religious freedom. Julian's reign lasted only 20 months, ending with his death from a spear wound during a campaign against the Persians in 363 AD. Legend claims he died declaring, "You have conquered Galilean," acknowledging Christ's victory over the old gods, but this story was probably invented by Christian historians. What is certain is that Julian's death ended the last attempt to make the Roman Empire pagan again. The barbarian migrations and border pressure. By the 4th century AD, the peoples whom Romans called barbarians were no longer the scattered tribes that earlier emperors had conquered or contained. Centuries of contact with Roman civilization had transformed Germanic, Celtic, and other groups into organized confederations with professional armies, sophisticated political structures, and clear territorial ambitions. They were still outsiders to Roman culture, but they were no longer primitive savages who could be easily defeated or dismissed. The Hunnic migrations from the Asian steppes had set these peoples in motion, creating a domino effect that pushed tribe against tribe across Central and Eastern Europe. The Goths, who had lived peacefully north of the Danube for generations, suddenly found themselves under pressure from Hunnic horsemen whose military tactics and nomadic lifestyle made them nearly impossible to defeat in conventional warfare. Faced with destruction or displacement, the Gothic Confederation chose to seek refuge within Roman territory. In 376 AD, Emperor Valens agreed to allow the Visigoths to cross the Danube and settle in Thrace, believing he could use them as foederati, allied troops who would defend Roman frontiers in exchange for land and subsidies. It seemed like a reasonable solution to the empire's chronic recruitment problems, as Germanic warriors were often superior to Roman soldiers in individual combat and could provide manpower for the understaffed legions. But the Roman officials responsible for managing the Gothic settlement proved corrupt and incompetent, cheating the refugees of promised supplies and treating them more like prisoners than allies. The Goths, desperate and increasingly hostile, began raiding the countryside for food and shelter. What had been intended as a peaceful resettlement became an armed invasion, with Gothic warriors living off Roman territory while Roman authorities struggled to contain them. The crisis came to a head at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where Emperor Valens led a Roman army against the Gothic Confederation and suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman military history. Valens himself was killed, along with most of his army, and the Goths were left free to ravage the Balkans without effective opposition. It was a disaster comparable to Cannae or the Teutoburg Forest, but unlike earlier defeats, this one could not be reversed through Roman resilience and superior resources. Adrianople marked the beginning of the end for Roman control of the empire's frontiers. The barbarians had demonstrated that Roman armies could be defeated decisively, and news of the victory spread rapidly among other tribes who had been considering their own moves into imperial territory. The migration period had begun, and Rome would never again enjoy undisputed military superiority over its neighbours. Theodosius and the empire's final split. Flavius Theodosius, known to history as Theodosius the Great, was the last emperor to rule both eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. His reign from 379 to 395 AD witnessed the final triumph of Christianity over paganism, the temporary pacification of the Gothic threat, and the administrative division that would make the empire's eastern and western halves effectively separate states with different destinies. Theodosius came to power in the aftermath of Adrianople, when the Eastern Empire desperately needed competent military leadership to deal with the Gothic crisis. He proved surprisingly effective at combining diplomacy with force, defeating some Gothic groups while negotiating settlements with others that transformed them from invaders into allies. His success demonstrated that barbarian pressure could still be managed through skillful leadership, but it also showed how dependent the empire had become on barbarian military service. The emperor's most significant religious policy was the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, which made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire, and began systematic persecution of both pagans and Christian heretics. Theodosius closed temples, banned sacrifices, and prohibited the Olympic Games, ending traditions that had lasted for over 1,000 years. It was the final victory of the Christian Revolution that Constantine had begun. Theodosius also had to deal with ambitious generals like Magnus Maximus and Eugenius, who challenged imperial authority and represented the last serious attempts to restore pagan worship. These civil wars drained imperial resources and weakened frontier defences at the worst possible time, when barbarian tribes were becoming increasingly organised and aggressive. Each internal conflict made the empire more vulnerable to external threats. The emperor's decision to divide the empire between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, was probably intended as a temporary administrative arrangement. But the division became permanent when both boys proved incapable of effective leadership and fell under the influence of ambitious advisors who preferred independence to cooperation. The unified Roman Empire died with Theodosius in 395 AD, though few contemporaries recognized the finality of what had happened. The Eastern and Western empires would remain nominally allied, but they increasingly pursued separate policies and competed for limited resources, rather than coordinating their responses to common threats. This division fatally weakened both halves of the empire, just when unity was most necessary for survival against the mounting barbarian pressure that would soon overwhelm the western provinces. The sack of Rome by Alaric. On August 24, 14 AD, Alaric I, king of the Visigoths, led his army through the gates of Rome and began a 3-day sack that shocked the ancient world. It was the first time in 800 years that a foreign enemy had captured the Eternal City, and the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Romans throughout the empire wondered whether the end of civilization itself was at hand. Alaric had spent years trying to negotiate a satisfactory arrangement with the Western imperial government, seeking official recognition as a Roman general, regular subsidies for his troops, and secure territories where his people could settle permanently. He was not a barbarian chieftain seeking to destroy Roman civilization. but rather a Gothic king who wanted to find a place for his people within the Roman system while maintaining their distinct identity. The imperial court at Ravenna, dominated by the half-Vandal general Stilicho, and later by other advisors, repeatedly broke agreements with Alaric and refused to meet his reasonable demands. They seemed to believe that the Gothic threat could be managed through deception and delay rather than honest negotiation, a strategy that might have worked against less organised enemies but proved disastrous when dealing with a competent leader like Alaric. After several failed negotiations and abortive sieges, Alaric finally captured Rome through treachery when sympathisers within the city opened the Salarian Gate during the night. The Visigothic army entered the city that had once ruled the known world, and found it largely defenceless, as most imperial forces were concentrated in northern Italy or defending other frontiers against similar threats. The sack itself was relatively restrained by ancient standards, lasting only 3 days and sparing churches and civilians who sought sanctuary in religious buildings. Alaric was an Arian Christian who respected Christian institutions, and his troops were disciplined professionals rather than wild barbarians seeking random destruction. Nevertheless, the psychological damage was enormous, as Romans struggled to comprehend how the Eternal City could fall to barbarian conquest. Alaric died shortly after leaving Rome, and his successors eventually negotiated a settlement that gave the Visigoth territories in southern Gaul and Spain, where they established their own kingdom. The sack had accomplished what years of diplomacy had failed to achieve, demonstrating that barbarian demands could no longer be ignored or indefinitely postponed. Attila the Hun and diplomatic disasters. In the middle of the 5th century, a new threat emerged from the Asian steppes that made previous barbarian invasions seem manageable by comparison. Attila the Hun, known to Christians as the Scourge of God, built a nomadic empire stretching from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea and used it to extract enormous tribute payments from both Eastern and Western Roman governments. His success demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted against Roman civilization. The Huns were unlike the Germanic tribes that had been pressing against Roman frontiers for centuries. They were nomadic horsemen whose entire society was organized for warfare and mobility, capable of appearing suddenly hundreds of miles from their last known location and disappearing just as quickly when resistance became too strong. Their composite bows could kill at ranges that made Roman infantry helpless, while their horsemanship allowed them to avoid close combat when it was disadvantageous. Attila unified the various Hunnic tribes and their subject peoples into a confederation that could field armies comparable in size to Roman legions, but far superior in mobility and tactical flexibility. He also proved remarkably skilled at diplomacy, playing Eastern and Western Roman courts against each other while extracting tribute from both. At one point, he was simultaneously receiving payments from Constantinople and threatening to attack Ravenna. The Huns' relationship with the Eastern Empire was particularly complex, as Emperor Theodosius II agreed to pay enormous annual tributes in exchange for peace. These payments, which amounted to thousands of pounds of gold per year, effectively made the Eastern Empire a Hunnic client state while bankrupting the imperial treasury and reducing resources available for defending other frontiers. It was a humiliating arrangement that demonstrated how desperate Roman diplomacy had become. Attila's invasion of Gaul in 451 AD brought together the strangest coalition in ancient history, as Romans fought alongside their former enemies, the Visigoths, Burgundians and Franks, against the common Hunnic threat. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was one of the bloodiest engagements in European history, with casualties so heavy that Attila withdrew despite not being decisively defeated. It was perhaps the last time Roman leadership could inspire effective resistance to barbarian invasion. The Hun's death in 453 AD ended the immediate threat to Roman civilization, as his empire collapsed into fratricidal warfare among his sons and subordinate kings. But the damage to Roman prestige and resources was irreparable, and other barbarian groups had learned valuable lessons about Roman weakness that they would soon apply for their own benefit. The fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire existed more in theory than in reality. The Emperor Romulus Augustus was a child controlled by his father Orestes, who had gained power by overthrowing the previous emperor with the help of Germanic mercenaries. The army consisted largely of barbarian foederati, who owed their loyalty to their own commanders rather than to Roman institutions. The government controlled little territory beyond Italy, and even that was subject to frequent barbarian raids. The end came not through dramatic battle or siege, but through what amounted to a military strike by unpaid soldiers. Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who commanded significant numbers of Haruli, Rugai, and other tribal warriors serving in the imperial army, demanded land grants for his troops similar to those that other barbarian groups had received in Gaul and Spain. When Orestes refused, Odoacer simply deposed him and assumed power himself. On September 4th, 476 AD, Odoacer forced the teenage Romulus Augustus to abdicate and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, officially returning them to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. It was a gesture of formal respect that disguised the reality of complete independence, as Odoacer had no intention of accepting Eastern imperial authority over his Italian kingdom. The Western Roman Empire had officially ceased to exist. The irony was that life in Italy continued much as before, with the same administrative structures, legal systems, and cultural institutions that had characterized late Roman government. Odoacer called himself king rather than emperor, but he governed through Roman bureaucrats, maintained Roman laws, and preserved Roman traditions. The end of the empire was less a catastrophic collapse than a quiet transformation that many contemporaries barely noticed. Few people at the time understood the historical significance of what had happened. The Eastern Empire still existed, still called itself Roman, and still claimed authority over the western provinces that were now ruled by barbarian kings. Many expected that imperial control would eventually be restored, as it had been after previous periods of political fragmentation and military defeat. But 476 AD marked the end of an era that had begun with Augustus nearly 5 centuries earlier. The Western Roman Empire was gone forever, though its ghost would haunt European politics for over 1,000 years through various attempts to revive imperial authority and universal rule. Justinian and the dream of reconquest. In 527 AD, a Macedonian peasant's nephew named Petrus Sabatius became Emperor Justinian I of the Eastern Roman Empire and embarked on one of history's most ambitious projects, the reconquest of the lost Western territories and the restoration of Mediterranean unity under Roman rule. For nearly 40 years, Justinian would pursue this dream through military campaigns, legal reforms, and architectural projects that transformed Constantinople into one of the world's great cities. The Eastern Empire that Justinian inherited was prosperous, stable, and culturally vibrant, but it was also profoundly different from the classical Roman state that Augustus had founded. Greek had replaced Latin as the language of government and education. Christianity had supplanted traditional religion entirely, and the emperor ruled as an absolute autocrat rather than a first citizen among equals. Yet Justinian and his subjects still considered themselves Romans, heirs to an unbroken imperial tradition. Justinian's reconquest began in North Africa, where the Vandal kingdom that had tormented the Western Empire for decades was overthrown by a small but highly professional Byzantine army, led by the brilliant general Belisarius. The campaign succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, restoring Roman control over the wealthy African provinces, and demonstrating that barbarian kingdoms could be defeated by competent leadership and disciplined troops. Encouraged by this success, Justinian turned his attention to Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom established by Theodoric was weakened by succession disputes and religious conflicts. The Gothic wars that followed lasted for nearly 20 years and devastated the Italian peninsula, turning once prosperous cities into depopulated ruins while Byzantine and Gothic armies fought over the fragments of Roman civilization. The emperor's greatest achievement was the Corpus Juris Civilis, a comprehensive codification of Roman law that preserved and systematized over 1,000 years of legal development. The Code Digest and institutes created by Justinian's legal commission became the foundation of European jurisprudence and remain influential in modern legal systems. It was an intellectual monument that outlasted all his military conquests, but Justinian's wars consumed enormous resources and overstretched the empire's administrative and military capabilities. The reconquered territories were expensive to defend, difficult to govern, and vulnerable to new invasions by enemies who had learned from previous defeats. The dream of restored Mediterranean unity would die with Justinian, though its pursuit had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of imperial ambition. The Plague of Justinian. Around 541 AD, just as Justinian's reconquest seemed to be succeeding, a devastating pandemic struck the Byzantine Empire and spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The Plague of Justinian, probably bubonic plague carried by rats aboard grain ships from Egypt, killed millions of people and undermined the emperor's ambitious plans to restore Roman dominance over the former imperial territories. The plague arrived in Constantinople during the summer months when the city's population was swollen by refugees from the ongoing wars in Italy and visitors attending the imperial court. The disease spread rapidly through the crowded neighbourhoods around the Golden Horn, killing rich and poor alike with terrifying efficiency. Contemporary sources describe bodies piling up in the streets and massive graves being dug outside the city walls. Justinian himself contracted the plague but survived, though many of his key advisors and administrators died during the epidemic. The imperial government struggled to maintain basic services as bureaucrats, soldiers and tax collectors succumbed to the disease. Trade networks collapsed as merchants refused to travel to infected areas, while agricultural production declined as farmers abandoned their fields or died before the harvest. The plague's impact on Justinian's military campaigns was catastrophic. His armies in Italy were decimated by disease, losing more men to plague than to Gothic weapons. The carefully planned logistics that had supported Byzantine operations across the Mediterranean broke down as ports and supply bases were abandoned. The reconquest that had seemed within reach suddenly became impossible to sustain. Economic consequences were equally severe, as the empire's tax base shrank dramatically while military expenses continued to mount. Cities that had supported large populations for centuries found themselves with empty houses and abandoned workshops. The demographic recovery would take generations, during which time the empire remained vulnerable to new enemies who had not suffered equivalent losses. The Plague of Justinian marked a turning point in Mediterranean history, ending the last serious attempt to restore classical Roman civilization and opening the way for new powers to dominate the region. The Byzantine Empire survived, but it would be forced to abandon its universal ambitions and accept a more modest role as a regional power based in Anatolia and the Balkans. The dream of Mediterranean unity died with the millions who perished in this pandemic. The rise of Islam and lost territories. In the early 7th century, while the Byzantine Empire was exhausted by decades of warfare against Sassanid Persia, a new religious and political movement was emerging in the Arabian Peninsula that would transform the entire Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world. Islam, founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the trading city of Mecca, combined monotheistic theology with Arabian tribal traditions to create a dynamic force that would conquer half the known world within a century. The early Islamic expansion began during the reign of Emperor Heraclius, who had just completed a brilliant campaign that defeated the Persians and restored Byzantine control over Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. These victories seemed to demonstrate that the empire was recovering from the plague and internal conflicts that had weakened it during the 6th century. But the Muslim Arabs who emerged from the desert represented a completely new type of challenge. The Muslim conquest of Syria began in 634 AD, with raids that Byzantine commanders initially dismissed as typical Bedouin banditry, but these were disciplined armies led by skilled generals like Khalid ibn al-Walid, unified by religious conviction and motivated by promises of paradise for those who died in holy war. Their tactical mobility and strategic coordination overwhelmed Byzantine forces that were accustomed to fighting Persians and barbarian tribes. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD was the decisive engagement that ended Byzantine control over the Levant. A carefully planned Muslim encirclement destroyed the largest Byzantine field army in the east, leaving Syria and Palestine defenseless against Islamic conquest. Jerusalem, the holy city that Heraclius had recovered from the Persians just years before, surrendered to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab in 638 AD. Egypt fell with surprising ease in 639-641 AD, as Muslim armies led by Amr ibn al-As exploited religious and ethnic tensions between the Orthodox imperial government and the Coptic Christian population. The loss of Egypt deprived the Byzantine Empire of its richest province and most important grain source, forcing Constantinople to rely on Anatolian resources that were far less productive. Within 20 years of Muhammad's death, the Islamic Empire controlled all the southern and eastern provinces that had been the foundation of Byzantine power and prosperity. The Roman Empire that had once ruled from Scotland to Sudan was reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, and parts of Italy. It was a transformation so rapid and complete that contemporaries struggled to understand what had happened to the ancient order of the world. Iconoclasm and religious art wars. In 726 AD, Emperor Leo III, issued an edict that would divide Byzantine society for over a century and fundamentally alter the relationship between imperial authority and religious practice. The iconoclastic controversy, literally meaning image breaking, began as an attempt to purify Christian worship by removing religious images from churches, but it evolved into a complex struggle over theological doctrine, political power, and cultural identity. Leo's motivations for launching iconoclasm were probably mixed. Combining genuine religious conviction with political calculation, many Eastern bishops had been influenced by Islamic criticism of Christian image veneration, arguing that icons violated the biblical prohibition against making graven images. The emperor may also have seen iconoclasm as a way to assert imperial authority over the church and reduce the political influence of monks and monasteries that controlled enormous wealth. The controversy split Byzantine society along regional, social, and theological lines. Eastern provinces, where Islamic influence was strongest, tended to support iconoclasm, while Western areas including Greece and southern Italy remained devoted to traditional icon veneration. The military supported the emperor's policy, perhaps because soldiers appreciated the simplified Christianity that iconoclasm represented, while urban populations were often hostile to changes in familiar religious practices. Resistance to iconoclasm was particularly strong among monks who saw the destruction of religious art as an attack on their entire way of life. Monasteries had been the primary creators and preservers of Christian artistic traditions, and many monks faced imprisonment, exile, or death rather than accept the imperial policy. Women also played important roles in the resistance, with empresses and aristocratic ladies often protecting icons and supporting persecuted clergy. The theological arguments on both sides were sophisticated and deeply felt. Iconoclasts argued that veneration of images was idolatrous, and that true Christian worship should be purely spiritual. Iconoclasts countered that icons were windows into the divine realm, and that Christ's incarnation had sanctified the material world. The dispute revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of religious experience and the proper relationship between heaven and earth. Iconoclasm officially ended in 843 AD, with the restoration of icon veneration under Empress Theodora, an event still celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy in Eastern Christian churches. But the controversy had lasting effects on Byzantine culture, weakening the empire's unity while strengthening the theological foundations of Eastern Christianity that would survive the empire's eventual collapse. The Crusades and Eastern-Western relations. When Pope Urban II called for a holy war to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control in 1095 AD, he launched a series of military campaigns that would profoundly affect the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe. The Crusades brought thousands of Western knights, pilgrims, and adventurers into contact with Eastern Christianity for the first time in centuries, creating opportunities for cooperation and cultural exchange that were largely squandered through mutual misunderstanding and competing ambitions. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I had requested Western military assistance against the Seljuk Turks who had conquered most of Anatolia, but he expected small contingents of professional soldiers who would serve under Byzantine command. Instead, he received massive armies of crusaders who considered themselves independent agents of God rather than auxiliary troops for a foreign empire. The cultural and religious differences between Eastern and Western Christians immediately created tensions that would plague all subsequent crusades. The First Crusade succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, capturing Jerusalem in 1099 AD and establishing crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast. But these victories came at the cost of Byzantine interests, as the Crusaders kept conquered territories for themselves rather than returning them to imperial control. The ancient Roman provinces of Syria and Palestine, which Byzantium still claimed as rightful imperial possessions, became Latin kingdoms ruled by Western nobles. Subsequent crusades brought more complications than benefits for the Byzantine Empire. The Second Crusade passed through imperial territory without achieving its objectives, while the Third Crusade was dominated by conflicts between Western rulers that had little relevance to Byzantine interests. The emperors found themselves caught between their desire for Western military assistance and their suspicion of Western motives and methods. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 AD was a complete disaster for Byzantine civilization, as Venetian merchants and Western knights diverted the expedition to attack Constantinople itself. The sack of the imperial capital was one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in European history. destroying priceless manuscripts, artworks, and religious relics while fragmenting the empire into competing successor states. The Latin Empire that replaced Byzantine rule lasted only until 1261 AD, but the damage to Eastern Christian civilization was irreparable. The Crusades ultimately failed to achieve their stated objective of permanently securing Christian control over the Holy Land, but they succeeded in fatally weakening the Byzantine Empire and deepening the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity that persists to this day. The final siege of Constantinople in 1453. On April 6, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire began the siege that would end over 1,000 years of Roman rule in Constantinople. The city that Constantine had founded as the New Rome was defended by fewer than 7,000 men, including Genoese volunteers and a handful of foreign mercenaries against an Ottoman army of perhaps 80,000 soldiers equipped with the most advanced artillery of the age. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, was a competent ruler who understood that his empire existed only within the walls of Constantinople and a few scattered fortresses. The once mighty state that had controlled the eastern Mediterranean for centuries had been reduced to a single city surrounded by Ottoman territory, yet Constantine refused Ottoman offers to surrender and retreat to the Morea, choosing instead to die as the last Roman emperor. The Ottoman siege was a masterpiece of early modern military engineering, featuring massive cannons designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had offered his services first to the Byzantines but switched sides when they couldn't afford his fees. The great gun called Basilica could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton, slowly battering down the Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. The defenders fought with desperate courage, repairing breaches during the night and launching counterattacks against Ottoman siege works. Italian engineers advised the emperor on defensive techniques, while Spanish soldiers provided expertise in gunpowder warfare. The siege became a final collaboration between Eastern and Western Christianity, as Catholic and Orthodox Christians fought together against Islamic conquest. The decisive assault came on May 29, 1453, when Ottoman troops overwhelmed the defenders at several points along the land wall. Constantine XI died fighting in the breach, his body so mangled by battle that it could only be identified by the double-headed eagle embroidered on his boots. With his death, the Roman Empire that had lasted for over 2,000 years finally came to an end. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe, but it also marked the completion of a historical transformation that had been developing for centuries. The city became the capital of a dynamic Islamic empire that would dominate southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come, while the survivors of Byzantine civilization scattered to Western Europe, carrying with them manuscripts and knowledge that would contribute to the Renaissance. What Rome left behind: laws, roads, and languages. The Roman Empire ended, but Roman influence continued to shape European civilization in countless ways that remain visible today. Perhaps no other ancient civilization left such a comprehensive legacy across so many different fields of human endeavor, from legal systems and architectural techniques to linguistic patterns and administrative methods that still influence modern government and society. Roman law was the empire's most enduring intellectual achievement, providing legal principles and procedures that became the foundation of European jurisprudence. The 12 tables that settled plebeian demands for written law evolved through centuries of judicial interpretation into sophisticated legal codes that addressed everything from commercial contracts to family relationships. Justinian's codification preserved this tradition and transmitted it to medieval and modern legal systems throughout Europe and beyond. The Roman road network, stretching over 250,000 miles at its peak, created transportation infrastructure that remained the foundation of European commerce and communication for over a millennium after the empire's fall. Roman engineers built roads to last, with deep foundations, carefully graded surfaces, and drainage systems that many medieval societies lacked the technical knowledge or financial resources to replicate. Many modern highways still follow routes first established by Roman surveyors. Latin language proved even more durable than Roman roads, evolving into the Romance languages that are spoken by hundreds of millions of people today. Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, and Romanian all developed from the Latin spoken by Roman soldiers, merchants, and colonists who carried their language to every corner of the empire. Even English, despite its Germanic roots, borrowed thousands of Latin words that reflect Roman influence on law, government, religion, and intellectual life. Roman architectural techniques, particularly the use of concrete and the arch, revolutionized construction methods and made possible building projects on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Age. The Pantheon in Rome, with its massive unreinforced concrete dome, remained the world's largest dome for over 1,000 years. Roman engineering principles influenced everything from medieval cathedrals to modern skyscrapers. Perhaps most importantly, Rome created the concept of universal citizenship and legal equality that would eventually inspire modern democratic movements. The idea that law should apply equally to all people regardless of birth or wealth was revolutionary in the ancient world, and it became a founding principle of Western political thought that continues to influence contemporary debates about human rights and social justice. The Holy Roman Empire's identity crisis. On Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, launching one of history's most persistent political fictions. The Holy Roman Empire, as it came to be known, claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Western Roman Empire, but it was actually a loose confederation of German territories that bore little resemblance to the unified state that had ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries. The medieval Holy Roman Empire was holy primarily in name, Roman only in aspiration, and an empire mainly in the imagination of its rulers. Real power belonged to local princes, bishops, and city-states, who paid lip service to imperial authority while pursuing their own interests. The emperor was elected by a small group of powerful nobles rather than inheriting power through dynastic succession, and his actual authority rarely extended beyond his own family territories. This strange institution persisted for over 1,000 years, from Charlemagne's coronation until Napoleon's dissolution of the empire in 1806 AD, primarily because it served the political needs of various groups who found the imperial ideal useful for their own purposes. The Catholic Church supported the empire as a counterweight to secular monarchies, while German princes used imperial titles and ceremonies to legitimize their own rule over their territories. The Holy Roman Empire's relationship to actual Roman tradition was tenuous at best. Its capital was wherever the emperor happened to be residing. It had no professional bureaucracy comparable to Roman administrative systems, and its military forces consisted of feudal levies rather than professional legions. The empire's laws were based on Germanic customs rather than Roman jurisprudence, and its cultural identity was thoroughly medieval rather than classical. Yet the empire's persistence revealed something important about the enduring appeal of Roman political concepts. The idea of universal rule, of a single authority that could unite diverse peoples under common law, remained attractive even when the practical foundation for such unity had disappeared. The Holy Roman Empire was a ghost of Rome, but it was a ghost that many people found comforting in an age of political fragmentation. The empire's eventual dissolution by Napoleon was almost anticlimactic, since it had been largely powerless for centuries, but its 1,000-year existence demonstrated the lasting influence of Roman political ideals on European imagination, even when those ideals could no longer be realized in practice. Why Rome still captures our imagination. More than 1,500 years after the fall of the Western Empire, and over 500 years since the conquest of Constantinople, Roman civilization continues to fascinate people around the world in ways that no other ancient society can match. Roman history appears in countless books, movies, and television shows, while Roman architectural styles influence modern buildings and Roman political concepts shape contemporary debates about democracy, citizenship, and the rule of law. Part of Rome's enduring appeal lies in the sheer scale of their achievements. No other pre-modern civilization controlled such vast territories or maintained political unity over such diverse populations for such extended periods. The Roman Empire at its height encompassed most of the known world, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the North Sea to the Sahara Desert. This geographic scope created a sense of universal significance that other ancient empires lacked. Romans also seem remarkably modern in their practical approach to politics, law, and administration. Unlike other ancient peoples who are often viewed as exotic or incomprehensible, Romans dealt with problems that modern societies still face. How to govern diverse populations, how to balance individual rights with collective security. Their solutions were often brutal by contemporary standards, but they were recognizably practical rather than mystical. The dramatic personalities of Roman history provide another source of fascination. Julius Caesar's ambition, Cleopatra's intelligence, Augustus's political skill, Nero's excess, Marcus Aurelius's philosophy, and Constantine's religious conversion offer character studies that combine human psychology with world historical significance. These were people whose personal decisions affected millions of lives and shaped the development of Western civilization. Roman military history also captures modern imagination through its combination of tactical sophistication and strategic vision. Roman legions conquered not through technological superiority but through discipline, organization, and adaptability that allowed them to defeat enemies with completely different fighting styles. The Roman approach to warfare was systematic rather than heroic, emphasizing engineering and logistics as much as individual courage. Perhaps most importantly, Rome represents both the possibilities and the dangers of imperial power. The Roman example shows how effective government and universal law can create prosperity and cultural achievement, but it also demonstrates how power corrupts, how success breeds arrogance, and how even the strongest institutions can decay when they lose public support and moral authority. The eternal city's eternal influence. Rome today is a living museum where ancient ruins stand beside Renaissance churches and modern apartment buildings, creating a unique urban landscape that spans over 2 millennia of continuous habitation. The city that once ruled the known world now attracts millions of visitors annually who come to see the physical remains of Roman civilization and to experience the atmosphere of a place where so much history unfolded. The Colosseum, perhaps Rome's most famous monument, continues to symbolize both the grandeur and the cruelty of Roman civilization. Its sophisticated engineering and architectural beauty coexist with memories of the gladiatorial games and public executions that entertained Roman crowds for centuries. Modern visitors can admire Roman technical achievement while contemplating the moral complexities of a society that combined legal sophistication with systematic violence. The Roman Forum, where Cicero delivered his orations and Caesar's funeral was held, now consists mainly of broken columns and fragmentary walls, but it remains one of the world's most evocative historical sites. Standing among these ruins, visitors can imagine the political debates and religious ceremonies that shaped Western civilization, connecting directly with events that occurred 2,000 years ago but still influence contemporary politics and law. Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign state, occupies the site where St. Peter was martyred during Nero's persecution of Christians. The transformation of Rome from the capital of a pagan empire to the headquarters of the Catholic Church represents one of history's most complete religious revolutions, yet the continuity of the city itself provides physical links between these different eras of human experience. Modern Rome incorporates Roman elements into contemporary architecture and urban planning, maintaining visual connections to its imperial past while accommodating the needs of a modern European capital. The city's layout still follows patterns established by ancient Roman urban planning, while its major monuments continue to serve as focal points for civic life and national identity. The phrase eternal city originally referred to Rome's imperial pretensions, but it has proven prophetically accurate in ways that ancient Romans never imagined. While the political empire disappeared long ago, Rome's cultural influence remains embedded in Western civilization through law, language, architecture, and political concepts that continue to shape human society throughout the world. In this sense, Rome truly was eternal, not because it lasted forever, but because it created institutions and ideas that transcended its own political existence and became permanent features of human civilization.